here so that we're, thank you, Andy. So I just want to welcome everybody back to the 9th TSP Part 4 working group meeting. We're just going to go through introductions really quickly. I'm Marcus Chatfield. I'm the Undersea Cable Coordinator for the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And we'll just kind of go through, Andy, if you'd like to go next, and then we can just kind of pass it on.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Andy Nair, Marine Affairs Coordinator with the Department of Land Conservation and Development.
Mike.
I'm Mike Graybill. I'm a herring rancher from Charleston.
Scott.
Scott McMullen. I'm with the Oregon Fishermen's Cable Committee in Astoria.
Blake.
Howdy, Blake Helm with the Oregon Department of State Lands.
Thank you, Blake. Jamie.
Jamie Faraday, Coastal at Large OPAC.
Thank you, Scott Marion. Tara Brock.
Morning, Tara Brock, Vice Chair of OPAC, representing Coastal Conservation and Chair of this working group.
Thank you, Tara. Lene.
Hi, Lene Rutledge, North Coast Representative.
Thank you, Lene. Joanne.
Hi, I'm Joanne Morris. Good morning from Google, representing industry.
Thank you. Laurel.
Laurel Hillman, Oregon Parks and Recreation Department.
Thank you, Laurel. Jason Bush.
Jason Bush, Executive Director of the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust, poet.
Thank you. Delia.
Delia Kelly, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Thank you, Delia. Natalia.
Morning, everyone. Natalia Stranatka, Submerged Cable Analyst, Department of State Land.
Thank you. Becky Anthony.
Yeah, Becky Anthony, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Thank you, Becky. Reed.
Hi, Reed Burgett, Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries. Thanks.
Thank you. Bill Henry.
Bill Henry, also with poet.
Thank you. Let's see. Susan.
Hey, good morning. Susan Chambers, South Coast Fisheries Rep. I'm driving, so I don't have my video on.
Thank you. Scott Marion.
Good morning. Got my audio figured out now. Scott Marion, ODFW Marine Program.
Thank you. Let's see. And then we have Stan Dynak.
Yeah, hi. Stan Dynak here from Microsoft, supporting the public sector.
Thank you. And Bill Davis. Oh, you're muted, Bill.
Sorry about that. Bill Davis, representing my own company, beachnecessities.com. Very interested in ocean welfare.
Thank you. And did I miss anybody? I'm not, I think that's everybody that was on the list here. All right, well, if anybody joins, we'll have them introduce themselves in a bit. So we're just gonna kind of move on. So just going over the agenda really quick. We just did the introductions. We're just gonna go over the agenda. We're gonna discuss our new timeline, and then kind of go over an overview of the specific sections that we're gonna review today. Have a quick break, and then from then on, it's going to be discussing the draft amendments. We're not gonna walk through them. I'll get to that when we go over to the specific sections to review. But we'll have another break at 10:15. We'll have lunch at 11:30, followed by public comment. And towards the end of the day, we'll discuss our kind of next steps and in the meeting at 2 p.m. So moving on, just to kind of discuss our new timeline. So highlighted in red circles are working group meetings. That's today. Ignore these blue squares. That's just kind of a artifact from me grabbing the calendar picture. But so today, having a working group meeting, and also on the 26th of July. Tomorrow there will be correspondence sent out to the coastal tribes here in Oregon to request coordination and consultation. Sorry, I'm losing my voice, which is a great day to do that. On Monday, so following today's meeting, I will be putting together any changes that we decide on today into a new draft, sending that out to DOJ and NOAA for review. And I don't really know, that could be like a 6-week timeline for getting comments back from NOAA. So hopefully we hear those back before July 26th. And then we tentatively have an OPAC meeting on August 3rd. But that is very, very close to our meeting, our working group meeting. So that's something that Andy's going to be working on.
Yeah, to clarify, Marcus, that's just the date that looks the best from a doodle poll that was sent out. But we haven't confirmed that with the executive committee.
Awesome. And then, you know, based on the legislative directive this week, the week of the 11th September, is when OPAC needs to make a recommendation of some sort. So, you know, as long as we get that OPAC meeting in here and there's no substantial issues that come up at the OPAC meeting, which we don't really have any control over here, other than if we have consensus, maybe there will be a little less to, you know, question over the amendments. But there needs to be some sort of recommendation made by that week. Are there any questions about the timeline right now? All right, I am not seeing any.
Marcus,
oh,
if I may,
absolutely.
I'll just provide a little bit of the backstory for how we get a couple of extra meetings and still meet the mandate that was directed to us in House Bill 2603, since I don't know that loop has been closed on communication here. So the bill itself said that it would, you know, OPAC would need to act within 2 years of the effective date of the legislation. And the way that you calculate that clock is, I guess, 90 days from sine die is the effective date of legislation. And so sine die in 2021 was in the middle of June. So 90 days puts that approximately into September. So 2 years from September 2021 gives us to September of this year. So that's the kind of clock legislatively. When our department was putting together our work plan for this amendment piece, you know, we were operating more on the 2-year biennial budget clock. And so we were hoping that everything could be done by the June timeline. We've been able to find some additional funds to keep Marcus on through the completion of this work. And therefore, given the things that still needed to be done to satisfy the department, including tribal consultation, Department of Justice review of the drafts, and we had a few of those outstanding issues, our leadership asked us to take the additional time that we had to make sure that we got everything done in the time that it was needed. So that's a brief summary of how and why the timeline changed from what we were originally hoping to meet to the new timeline. It looks like Delia, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andy. Marcus, a quick question about the June 12th draft sent to DOJ and NOAA. Is the intent on your part that you would be able to get their input and, you know, sort of integrate that into something that we could get as a working group ahead of the July 26th meeting?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
The reason I don't have you know, reviewed draft sent out to working group somewhere on this is I don't know when I'll get that
Of course.
back from NOAA and DOJ, but whenever I do, the plan is I hope that that is before July 26th so that I can put it, kind of put them both together and send them off as like, here's the draft that's been approved. This has been reviewed by NOAA, this has been reviewed by DOJ. These were the changes that they suggested, if there are any, and let's discuss that on July 26th so that we can get
Perfect.
something to OPAC, soon after that so that they can make a decision.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, perfect. Any other questions regarding this? Thank you, Andy, also for that background. All right. I am not seeing any questions. So we're going to just kind of jump into talking about what our focus today is. So there were 7 potential changes brought to OPAC. Those changes were things that were either not reached, we did not reach consensus on them in the working group, or they were things that smaller groups within the working group either put together alternate language for and got to me before the OPAC meeting, or they were things that were flagged as potential problems for NOAA or something like that, and they were worked on internally by staff in order to meet federal consistency. So we'll go through those step by step here in a bit. Also, there was the DOJ review of the draft amendments. I had sent that out. Sorry, it got sent out so late, but I didn't receive it until this weekend. So I hope you all got that email and are able to look at that draft and see the changes that were suggested by DOJ. And then we're also going to address some comments that were made by OPAC on the draft amendments. But before we move on to anything else, I wanted to just make sure that everybody's clear on what we're talking about today and see if there are any questions regarding those 3 points, and before we kind of jump into the meat and bones of it. Okay. I'm not seeing any questions regarding it, so that's great, and we can just kind of move on. So we did have a break scheduled, but that is for way 30 minutes from now. So we'll just kind of jump into the potential changes from here out throughout this meeting. I'll probably be jumping back and forth between this PowerPoint and the DOJ review, because the DOJ review may have already addressed some of these potential changes, and we'll kind of see how people are feeling on it. So the first potential change is to strike out this section. This is in policies under, I can actually, let me do the jumping back and forth now. Let me stop my share really quick so that I can pull up the other, and we can maybe put them side by side. So, all right. Let's make this a little bit bigger here. Bear with me, folks, sorry. And let's see. All right, can you see both of these, the Word document on the left and the PowerPoint on the right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me center this a little bit better so that we can actually see the wording here. So the change that DOJ made is that they took out the bulleted number 5 here, and they put in, they combined them. They combined this first sentence in the PowerPoint with number 4 to make this paragraph here. And so I just wanted to discuss that with folks and see how what your thoughts are on that.
I'm supportive. This is Scott.
Thank you, Scott.
Marcus, I'm curious whether DOJ provided a rationale for each of their changes.
Well, there was this written evidence was flagged as a potential issue, a potential conflict with NOAA, and since it is covered in a little bit different wording that will potentially go over better with NOAA in another section, they thought that this number 5 bullet was kind of problematic, and so just removing it and combining it here, since we don't really need a numbered bullet for one thing, was kind of how they did that. Any other thoughts? I don't see. It's hard for me to follow everybody's raised hands and such.
This is Blake, DSL.
Yeah, Blake.
I don't see any, issues with that. So.
All right. Great. Do we have? I just want to check in with folks to see if there's no other discussion about this. I just want to see if we have consensus on changing it as DOJ has put forth here, and just make sure that there's no dissent on that change. All right. I'm not seeing anything, so we will move on to the next potential change. And if the day keeps going like this, we might be done at noon. I like to be optimistic. So the second potential change is to add into, and these are not really in order as far as where they are in the document, unfortunately. I'm sorry, folks. But the other potential change that was brought forth is adding an objective H, which is keep Oregon a viable place to land submarine telecommunications cables. Now, there was some discussion during OPAC that the word viable is fairly vague and fairly subjective. So that was the information, the comments that we got back from OPAC, but otherwise, any thoughts on this? Any questions? See, I see a chat. Jamie, would you like to, can you say that out loud so that we can capture it?
Sure. I think it's unnecessary, as was already reported at the last OPAC meeting I mentioned, that it's more of an industry voice than what is coming out of OPAC and DLCD, et cetera. And if the TSP4 is written appropriately, then and with clear intent of what is expected of the applicants, then the applicant is going to be encouraged to apply for whatever it is they're asking for, whether it's a cable or a communication cable. And so I just think that it's an unnecessary addition.
Thank you, Jamie. Any other thoughts on this objective? Mike Graybill?
Yeah, I would, this relates, my attention is drawn to this the same way that it's drawn to the very, very initial statement at the top of the document. Keep going. This preamble stuff. I don't understand the fact that that fiber optic cables are explicitly called out in this adoption stuff, when my understanding is that the substantial portion of the work of this work group is to broaden the scope beyond telecommunications cables. Again, if we've gone to the lengths to say utilities infrastructure and other devices on, in, or under the seabed, then calling out specifically submarine telecommunications cables in a bullet like this kind of skews the attention back to what the original historic intent of Part 4 was. And it sort of overlooks the fact that they're being revised because we want to have it become more inclusive.
Thank you, Mike. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, Marcus, this is Scott.
Go ahead, Scott.
Just since I'm the one that proposed this bullet, I will speak to it. I think it was originally meant to be more inclusive, and there was some discussion earlier by the working group that some people were uncomfortable with were potentially uncomfortable with some of the new uses that could come. And so the bullet was modified to recognize that here's a use that we do know about and that I guess, some we're more comfortable with. And I would point out that the state in the past, Governors Kulongoski, Kitzhaber 1, Kitzhaber 2, and Governor Brown all have sent letters to the Pacific Telecom Conference inviting companies to consider landing in Oregon. Said that they would be reviewed and their applications reviewed. Didn't give them a pass. It just said that we would welcome cables to come to Oregon, and I think that was reflective of the benefits that submarine fiber optic cables bring to the state. And those that attended the field trip we had to the data center in Portland heard comments about how valuable those cables are to the state. So, and I think we can also look back to the legislative intent. Representative Gomberg had indicated that he did not want to stop cables from coming to the state of Oregon. So I think it's appropriate that we acknowledge that Oregon has been a good place to land cables, and that we'd like to keep it a good place to land cables. We've made some modifications to make sure that that we're a better place now. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. I think Lene is next. Lene.
Hi. So, am I on?
You are.
Okay. So I want to echo what both Jamie and Mike have said. I believe that the objective is unnecessary. I don't think it's consistent when you look at the preserve and protect parts in 3, 4, and 5, that's necessary to have this objective. I really think it's insufficient to defend it by saying things like, well, it's not a mandate and it's not related to enforceable policy. What we say matters. And I clearly believe that we don't need this objective. And I think that by keeping it in place, you're going to hear from many of us at the OPAC meeting who will say, we don't have consensus on this and it's inappropriate to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Lene. Natalia, then Tara.
Yeah, I kind of want to follow up what Mike pointed, because when I review the draft, I had the same question in the preamble. Can you tell the history a little bit why particular fiber optical cable was added there? In the first sentence on the top, it's not like we wanted to cover all utility and pipelines. It's amendment related to fiber optical cables. Why that specific was added?
Why was fiber I mean, that
first
was
paragraph in the beginning, because it was not there.
that was there in 2000. When in
Yeah,
2000.
governing easements for submarine fiber optic cables. I mean, this preamble are related to all part 4, so we just highlight just fiber optic cables.
I understand that this was put in, other than this very beginning part that said originally just LCDC. This was put in when these were originally adopted in 2000, when this part 4 was very specific and called out submarine cables, fiber optic cables. It did mention pipelines and other utilities, but it had a very strong focus on fiber optic cables at that time. And I think that just is, for history, that is the type of undersea utility that we have the most of and saw the most of at that time. And that was why this was put in back in the year 20 something years ago. I am myself, like, I don't know that we have to keep where it says fiber optic cables there, or to call it out. I think that this is just to keep historical record of what it was originally done, but this can be changed. So I mean, that's my thoughts on it. I don't know if Andy has more to say on that.
Well, and the intent is that the dates in that paragraph would be changed so that it's reflective of the amendment that we complete this year. So it's a tracking mechanism by which you can go back to the processes and the decision-making bodies who were involved. That goes to the co-stewardship role of the commission and OPAC together to steward the territorial sea plan.
Well, I don't have any question. Yeah, dates would be changed. I mean, but this is like first paragraph when you read a preamble about territorial part 4, and it's really, I don't know, maybe this is just my view, but as I saw Mike said the same. It's particular like focus, it just stuck fiber optical cables. And you automatically thinking that part 4 will rate just only fiber optical cables. I'm wondering if we can change for like general terms of like submarine cables, whatever we have, utility and etc. It just really make a focus in just for fiber optical cables in the first paragraph of preamble. So that's only the question regarding that fiber optic.
The very specific, right. And I think that you could change that to uses of the seafloor.
Yeah, or something.
And it would be reflective of the process and still the intent.
Yeah.
I just think at that the preamble was written at the time when fiber optic cables were the preeminent kind of use that was coming to our state.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalia. Tara, you were next.
Nope. I think I'm okay.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, I was thinking about weighing in here. I was trying to think if there was a middle ground. If we wanted to think about something related to critical infrastructure and not make this specific to cables. But reading through the other objectives, we've had this conversation before. I think this is covered in those other objectives. So I'm struggling with it. I do think it's a bit repetitive or unnecessary because I believe it's covered by the other objectives and goal. That said, I'm not wholly opposed to including something on this. DOJ, I think, suggested that this be something more along the lines of around, providing a clear regulatory pathway for the landing of cables in Oregon, or something like an objective that was more objective in that way. So just wanted to put that out there. So here I said I wasn't going to comment, and then I did.
Thank you. Jamie, can you, Jamie, and then maybe Delia, if you would like to just kind of say what you said in chat so that, you know, for the group's benefit. It's hard for me to read the chat while I'm doing all of this.
Sure, I'll go first. I agree with Scott's wish to. I mean, he's been there from the get-go, encouraging responsible development of fiber optics. I just don't see that, and the idea of having an industry, basically it's an industry or a promotional blurb in a document that is meant for policy. That's basically what I think just inappropriate. You know, if it stays in, it's not gonna be a deal breaker for me, but I just don't see it as necessary.
Thank you, Jamie. Delia, can you speak to what you wrote in the chat, please?
Oh, yeah, I put it in the chat, sorry, because the preamble discussion seemed a little distracting from the objectives discussion, but I was just pointing out that the way that preamble was written, it's specific to the rules adopted by the State Land Board in 1999. So we wouldn't want to change the context of what those rules were adopted for. They were adopted for cables. So either that whole sentence is no longer necessary in the preamble, or we keep it as is, but I don't think we change the preamble. It represents a rule that was adopted in 1999.
Thank you, Delia. You know, and I don't think that we have to really get into like wordsmithing here, but I think if the group is amenable to it, I can easily just put in like a history of the TSP Part 4 small section in the background section where we keep the stuff that's in the preamble and then talk about what's happened this year just really quickly, and that way it's there and it's record, you know, if people would like that. But I don't know that that's super substantive as far as you know, what we're doing here.
I do think, can I just add to that real quick, Marcus?
Absolutely.
I do think that in terms of long-term use of this policy, it is useful to state agency staff who come on board and are learning about the territorial sea plan. Maybe they haven't even worked in the marine environment before, to have a little decoder at the beginning of each of the parts of the plan. So that's just my 2 cents.
All right, thank you, Delia. Mike, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I agree with the discussion and the direction this is going. It's just the positioning of the preamble that it just blasts you with history. When, in my view, I'm expecting some context setting for what I'm about to read. And so the historic information is essential to include for all the reasons that have been identified. But why not put it in some kind of an appendix or under some history leading up to the current changes so that it's really flagged? But as it sits right now, you sit down, you see this heading on this thing, and then it says, oh, this is about undersea cables. And the dates are confusing because, one, in looking at the draft, you can't see when it's adopted. But if it's really clearly flagged as the history leading that precedes the current amendments or something after that fashion, it's thrown me off base every time I've looked at it. And if it's throwing me off base and I'm a member of this committee and it's sat through 9 meetings, I can see how someone who's sitting down cold with it is just going to think that that's what it's about. So the information should be included, but if there's going to be that introductory paragraph, it should be really about what the current content of the document is, that the scope has been broadened over prior amendments or prior versions, et cetera.
Thank you. Blake?
I just wanted to agree with that portion, what Mike said. I think the purpose of the preamble is to talk specifically about the current version of the document. So I think it would be a good idea to put it in an appendix, but in all honesty, I think there are probably a lot more bigger fish to fry in this discussion, and I think we should probably either put a pin in this and move on, or just come to a consensus vote.
Yeah, I agree with you, Blake. Will make note of doing something with the preamble, but I'd like to get back to objective H here. And I'm feeling that we're not at consensus with this. And so we can kind of just put a pin in this whole conversation unless there's more substantial discussion that folks feel like they need to have about objective H. Otherwise, I think we can move on to the next potential change, and we can talk more about this at another time if we have time for it. I am not.
Marcus, can I
Yep.
ask what happens to it if we don't reach consensus?
Well, if you don't reach consensus, it won't be in the draft that gets sent off. And if it is something that if the folks who are proponents of adding it still really want to see it there, then they provide that to me and it gets presented to OPAC again as it was last time.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Reed, can you say your comment to folks so that I can capture that?
Yeah, sure. I was just looking back through the document and, like some other people have said, I sort of feel like G indicates a goal of continuing current uses, which are, dominantly telecommunication cables. So I don't think that there's a lack of encouragement of that the way that it is without H. And then the next paragraph does go into, a statement that says that Oregon's coast is a prime landing zone for fiber optic telecommunication cables. So I think that's pretty strongly worded as a signal of encouragement that this isn't designed to keep cables out. So that's just my thought.
Thank you, Reed. Excellent. Blake, I saw your hand raised. It seemed...
I was just going to make a very similar point to Reed, but he beat me to the punch. Thank you, sir.
Excellent. All right. Excellent. Okay, so we will move on to the next just for time's sake. So this is the next potential change. Let me see if I can get to it in this document as well so that we 4.3. So this is the changes as made. So on your right-hand side in the PowerPoint, the highlighted section was the proposed addition and or subtraction in these two sections. And on the left-hand side is DOJ's recommended language for those. Give you a moment to kind of read through it, and I don't know if you guys can see all of this, but things are blocking my view, so I don't know if it's blocking your view. Laurel?
So the yellow part on the right is now rewritten by DOJ on the left with the
exactly
red underlining. Okay, just
exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah, and to be clear, those two things happen separately from each other. So the recommended changes which were brought to OPAC as a discussion item were not necessarily what Steve used in his work. He was going through an assessment of the draft that we had, and I believe that the comments that he made in this were just his normal kind of review from a contextual perspective. I think he was informed by the discussion at OPAC, but I do think that the change that he provided addresses the concerns that were raised.
Yeah, some of the specific changes were that he called out section 4.3 so that it's not, so it's less ambiguous as to which section is being talked about. And then specifically for evaluating coastal effects of the project or development action versus just evaluating the project under the policies, goals, and objectives. Any thoughts on this? I can't see any hands raised. How are folks, are we feeling good about the DSL change? There is, we can look at 4.3.4 here because these are other changes that were made by DOJ that tried to put some kind of sideboards on the DSL being able to waive certain evaluation items and kind of hopefully hits what was trying to be hit at in our original discussion. Blake?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you know, I've been looking at this and, you know, I don't see any issue with it, you know, with the changes. So we're thumbs up over here at DSL. So
Thank you. Mike says it looks good. Any other thoughts on this? I think that this kind of hits to the point that you brought up at OPAC as well, Laurel, where this applies to all proposed cables, and then there's the sideboards about telecommunications cables. Go ahead, Laurel.
Yeah, I'm just reading that last part of the sentence under there, and the first part of the sentence implies that we're talking about exemptions for telecommunication cables, but is everybody reading it to mean that, the whole sentence, when you read it together? Just to, I mean, it's my first time reading it, so with the edits. I mean, that's the implication, right? Because you're saying we have experience with telecommunication cables, so because of that, DSL may waive those
you think,
items.
Laurel, we need, you know, DSL may waive the evaluation items for telecommunication cable?
Well, it doesn't say
or
that
proposed-
explicitly. I mean, the implication
Yeah, I mean,
is
I
because
think
that's
that's what
you're
you're
saying
getting
in
at, right?
the
is
first
maybe,
part, but yeah, I don't know. It's
yeah, it might need a pronoun in there or something to reference back, you know, but I mean, the way I read it was that it was specific to telecommunication cables, but I don't want that ambiguity. So if there's a way to, you know, resolve that, I'm happy to, you know, figure that out.
I agree with both of them. I think it could be misinterpreted to mean DSL because we know so much about cables. DSL may waive evaluation for pipelines, utilities, and fixtures.
I
And
see
I
what
don't
you're
want
saying.
that. So could we just add?
Yeah, I guess I read the sentence specifically applying to telecommunication cables. And I think that the issue that we were also trying to tease apart here was power cables versus telecommunications cables, right? So I think that's why it was specific here. And I read it that you wouldn't waive items that are specifically identified for pipelines, utilities, or fixtures for pipelines, utilities, or fixtures. Like I wouldn't read the sentence that it would apply to those uses. That's why I think the first part of the sentence is important.
Yeah, I think the context really does help provide, but you know, if there's a way to make it more clear, I'm always happy to accommodate that type of stuff.
I guess if we don't have, if there's, if we have consensus that this is an okay change, notwithstanding the little bit of confusion that we're having on this last bit, I can flag this for DOJ and say, hey, there was some confusion about this, and is there a potential different wording, or I can give some potential other wordings to him. So to try and keep the intent to where we have the sideboards around the waiver that are very specific about telecommunications cables.
Yeah, Marcus, I think it's a, we have the DOJ guidance in this instance, but that does not mean that we can't, craft a sentence that we think is clear and have him read that sentence for the effect and the, for his legal analysis. So I do think we have flexibility to suggest language that could be clearer if we so want. It's just that, he did provide a review of what was there and suggestions on how to include sideboards so that we were trying to match the intent of our discussion as a group with the language that's here.
Thank you, Andy. Jason and then Delia.
Yeah, clearly it seems like there's a concern with this language. It is confusing. However you look at it. I've heard three different interpretations here. So I'm kind of wondering whether the first clause in that sentence, starting with however and ending with territorial sea, is even relevant. Isn't really the core point here that DSL may waive evaluation of items for telecommunications that are specifically identified for pipeline utilities or fixtures in stop? And doesn't that, and now that I think about it, isn't that kind of true for everything? And I'm not looking at the specifics here, but it might be the case that there are requirements for one of these four items that don't apply to the other three. And that might be telecommunications, or it might be pipeline, or it might be a utility. I'm not entirely sure. So is the concept really relevant for all the items? In other words, you don't need to apply all the criteria, since the criteria apply to all four categories, and only some of the criteria apply to each one of those categories.
Thank you, Jason. Delia, I think you're next.
Well, Jason, as always, makes an interesting point. What I was going to say before was that I liked what Andy was saying about being specific about the telecom cables versus potential new electrical cables. And this sentence would do that with some tweaking, but I do think it would need to follow DSL may waive the evaluation items for, and we do need a specific who gets that waiver if we keep this language in here. But again, Jason raises a good point that, maybe the whole thing could just be simplified. Although I think, Jason, maybe the reason why Steve wrote it this way was because he was trying to drill down and get as specific as possible, as opposed to the yellow highlighted version, which was more broad. So I think the direction of DOJ is going towards more specific.
Thank you, Delia. Scott and then Blake.
Thank you, Marcus. Well, I guess in my mind, DSL, if the requirements are specifically written for pipelines, utility fixtures, they're obviously not for cables. So what we're talking about is things that aren't specific for pipelines, utilities, and fixtures. So I think it should be, I think a simple way to fix it is to just say DSL may waive evaluation items that it deems not necessary, just like I think the language that DOJ approved earlier, and it says very specifically in the other language about how DSL consults with all the other agencies that are listed, and they're all spelled out. So every single agency has an opportunity to say, yes, that this particular item is needed as far as we're concerned. But maybe it's an economic study that all the agencies say, you know, we really don't need an economic study to determine if this cable should be landed. And I think to be really, to make good policy, it should really apply to everything. If a ocean outfall is a known use that doesn't require an aesthetic study to determine how the aesthetics are going to change by an underwater diffuser, I think the state should be able to waive that requirement and say, you know, this isn't something that's really necessary on this application. So I think good governance would just simply say DSL and the agencies that they collaborate with on it will make a determination on what is needed in each case and what isn't needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Blake, and then we'll take a quick break.
I was just only going to point out, I think Jason asked, you know, there might be some, you know, requirements that apply to, you know, all 4 types of uses, or, you know, one use or this use or the other use. But I think the way that it's set up, if I'm remembering correctly, is that there are requirements for all 4, as in, you know, cables, pipelines, utilities, and fixtures. And then there are separate requirements that are specifically identified for only pipelines, utilities, or fixtures. So it's a one or the other. And that's it.
Thank you, Blake. We can continue this discussion. Let's continue it at 9:30. Let's take a quick break so that we can stretch our legs.
There's a big looks like there's a big fiber optics cable ship sitting off the bar of Coos Bay.
All right, kind of jumping back into the discussion. Let's see, Scott, did you have your hand raised or is that legacy hand from before?
The legacy hand.
Okay, no worries, just checking. So speaking to this potential change and the kind of potential changes that DOJ brought forth, I kind of see a couple of different, there seems to be a couple of different pathways we could go here. One would be to clarify that last sentence in a way that kind of meets the criteria that the folks have brought up. Another thing to do would be to delete part of that sentence, and then also delete these sections that say additionally for pipelines or other utilities or fixtures, and just give DSL, you know, say that DSL may waive items of the evaluation deemed unnecessary or, you know, determined to be unnecessary in that sentence, and then take off these sideboards down here. Or in order to make it a little bit more clear, this could say additionally for power cables, pipelines, other utilities, or fixtures. So those are kind of the 3 things that have been floating through my head when we're talking about this. Delia?
I might be missing something here, but do we even need to mention the waiver in 434? It's covered in 4.3, which has an umbrella function over 434 and everything else under 4.3. So if 4.3, if we agreed to Steve's language there, which I think we generally did, may waive any information or evaluation requirements in this section for that action, which would include anything. Do we still need the other waiver mention in 434? I don't think we do, but I may be missing something. Like maybe has an idea.
I agree. I mean, I think your interpretation is right. If we have that waiver in 4.3 that covers everything in 4.3, which includes the inventory content, then what's the point of saying in 4.3.4 that we have the same discretion to waive those requirements for a telecommunication cable? It does seem unnecessary. So I don't know.
Thank you, Blake. Tara?
Yeah, I was gonna echo that. That is also the discussion we had in relation to including this waiver was, if you look at the initial highlighted section of Marcus's slide here, that's why we remove the waiver language in 4.3.4 because 4.3 at the top would now cover that. So I'm not sure why DOJ added this specificity here. Perhaps they did not have our deletion of the waiver language there.
All right, so
So I feel like there's agreement on that point. If it's covered above and it was slightly unclear in the language that was there, then I'm hearing a suggestion to end the paragraph after the territorial sea plan
so
period.
removing this
and remove that. And I'm seeing thumbs up to that suggestion. Because it is covered above. So
I guess one thing that was changed in this 4.3.4 that would come after this in the original version, but doesn't in this one. It has to do with the items that are specifically identified for pipelines, utilities, or fixtures. I think if we delete this last part, due to the kind of broad nature of the addition to 4.3, that we should remove this additionally for pipelines or other utilities or fixtures in these sections down here. Because then DSL has that broad authority to waive if it's determined to be unnecessary. Otherwise, it's not talked about. Blake?
I see your point, Marcus, but just off the top of my head, I liked that we had those different kind of requirements because, I have institutional knowledge that lets me know, here are some things that we would not require for telecommunication cables. But in 30 years, when, hopefully I'm retired, maybe that information is retained by the department. I mean, I don't want to say that we would be negligent, and I'm not trying to say that, but I'm just trying to be, very forthright in that institutional knowledge retention is a problem with state agencies. I think we can all agree on that. So, I think it would benefit us to retain that in the territorial sea plan.
All right, then I guess my proposal in that case is that we modify the last sentence that was in the original that to where it says telecommunications cables, and then down in these sections we say additionally for power cables, pipelines, other utilities or fixtures, just to be clear that we're calling out specifically telecommunications cables, so that since they're known use, whereas power cables are not. Because I think that that's not called out, and that was something that was brought up. It was brought up during our working group meetings, and it was also brought up during OPAC. Laurel brought it up that this was, this is specifically about a known use being telecommunications cables, and that may not apply to power cables. So those are my thoughts on it. I don't know if folks have other thoughts on that type of change. I am hearing pretty clearly that removing this sentence is it has consensus.
Laurel, you have your
sorry.
hand raised. Go ahead.
Oh, so did Julia. I think she had her hand up first.
Oh, sorry, Julia. Go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, I would agree with removing the last sentence. And I hear your point, Marcus, that then there's no description for why we segmented out the other features. But I don't think it's a hang up. I don't see that as a hang up to me. I think that it would flow. It would be something that could be interpreted by state agency staff who are implementing the policy. I think that the items that we've identified as not necessary for cables are things like wave regime, things above the seafloor. And I still think that's true. So I would be comfortable removing the last sentence of 434 and then leaving the rest of it as is. If you, where was you wanted to add, oh, to the undersea cables installed. If you wanted to turn that into just telecom cables, then I think it would be difficult for us to understand why there's a difference between electric cables and fiber optic cables, since the installation location and their, I don't think that there's a difference there from a habitat perspective. So I think I would suggest just removing that sentence and leaving the rest of it as is. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Delia. Laurel?
I had a different version of what Julia said, but I agree with everything she said. So yeah, in the interest of time, just add one to what Julia said, remove that. And I think that the waiver concept is covered above, so you don't really need to do anything else.
Okay, thank you, Laurel. Blake?
Yeah, I don't want to keep this conversation going needlessly, but I think, if we delete that sentence, however, it might be beneficial to, on that last sentence, ending territorial sea plan, to add, or the requirements were waived as described in section 4.3 above.
I like that. Any are we at consensus with this? I'd like to just kind of get like a feel for the group. Thumbs up. I'm feeling good about that. I guess a better way to bring it up is there anybody opposed to that change?
Will you restate restate it one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. So it would be just removing this last this highlighted or not highlighted, this sentence that I have here, and then adding to after the territorial sea plan, say as otherwise addressed another part of territorial sea plan, or I don't remember exactly how Blake said it, but
I just put
as
it in the
described.
chat. I just put it in the chat. So, or the requirements were waived as described in section 4.3 above.
Excellent. Yes. All right. I'm not seeing any more comment on this, so let's move on to the next potential change. So this is in the decommissioning section, 4.7. So the potential change was this this addition that's in red on the left, highlighted on the right. The highlighted version was the version that was brought forth to us. The one in red is DOJ's edit to that. If I gotta see if there's what kind of edit there is. It's just more active voice. And it gets rid of the wording of environmental impact assessment, so it doesn't get confused with other environmental impact assessments that may be required. Thoughts on this potential change, Scott?
Yeah, I had a proposed rewording. I don't oppose to what DOJ has done. except when it talks about quantifies the level of damage to the environment. I thought maybe instead of that, we could use the word proposed by one of my board members, Stan Dynak, who's on the call, and just say demonstrating the lesser impact to the environment by leaving the cables in situ versus removal. And I'll paste that into the chat.
Jeff?
Hi. For what it's worth, I do like what Scott just proposed because it asks for a comparative effects analysis rather than just asking for one side of it. What seems to be in the red language would only be asking for the side of the analysis that relates to the damage caused by removal, not the effect of leaving it in place. So it seems more valuable to have both so that you can actually justify that it is better to leave it in place.
Thank you, Jeff. Jason?
Yeah, I like where this conversation is going. I think the two recommendations are both fine. I guess when I was reading about it, the word justification kept coming up for me. In other words, the owner operator shall submit an assessment of the environmental impacts and coastal effects that justifies the decision to leave the. So you're getting back to comparing the cost and benefits of leaving it in versus taking it out. But I'm happy with however that gets said.
Thank you, Jason. Scott Marion?
Hi, yeah, I like Jason's concept there of framing it in the context of a justification, because if we are only identifying environmental disturbances and comparing that to a no removal situation, I guess that to me that gets a little ambiguous, because imagine a buried cable in soft sediments. Removal of that cable, which is what we want people to do, is going to come with some level of disturbance. You might call that damage, slight and transient, but it's I would say more damaging than just leaving the cable in place. So that baseline is not really one that would warrant leaving the cable in place, because that it's a very slight disturbance of pulling the cable out of soft sediment. So I do feel like having some, like the concept that we're asking for a sort of a higher level of demonstration that there could be damage as a justification for leaving cable in place, and I like making that explicit.
So what I'm hearing is support for the change, but potentially changing it to some combination of the wording that Jason and Scott proposed. That's kind of what I'm hearing so far. I'm trying to see. Oh, so many people have their hands raised. Delia, I think you're next.
Yeah, I like where this discussion is going as well. And I would like to see some alternatives to E before we say like, yeah, sounds great. So whether Jason and Scott could draft something, put it in Scott's put something in the chat there. Okay. So maybe Jason could add his suggestions there for us to look at. I wanted to mention that 1 through 4 in this section is already in statute. And so I'm a little concerned that by adding E and the other edits in here in this way, that then we have 2 policies that say the same thing but are slightly different variations. And I don't know, did Steve talk about that at all? Did he consider that already? I mean, that's part of his review, is making sure that all of the policies there's no conflict there. So should we assume, I guess maybe this question is for Andy, should we assume that because these are his suggestions, there's no conflict there?
Yes, Delia, that's how I would interpret
Okay.
his work on this. And I think that we can, agree that we like the change in language, the second half of the sentence, and have him review that revision from his perspective. So if the group likes that, and I also agreed with the conversation and the suggestion. So I would be comfortable with us making that change and then having him review that specifically to ensure that he doesn't see any issues with it.
Okay.
Thank you, Andy. Let's see, trying to see who else had their hand raised. Jason, is your hand like a legacy hand, or is that new? Oh, all right. Natalia?
Yeah, I'm quite, so we have something similar in the end of this section, just to make sure that it's not like double checking. It's just rephrasing in the end of 4.71, we have, there is maybe situation when removal, there is maybe cases. So it's like, it's something similar, but just 2 times repeated in different way.
This was flagged by Steve as repetitive and a potential deletion, that we should potentially delete this section to keep it within the other portion of the decommissioning. Just to throw that out there, so that this highlighted paragraph here.
I mean, that's like more clear and simple that here is owner or operator. Then we need to define owner and operator, because there could be 2 different.
Well, owner and operator is already in the language from the House bill, so we are going to have to define that anyway within our glossary, because that is, I mean, it wasn't defined in the House bill either, but we should define it here so that it's understood. That was also flagged that we need to do that.
Maybe somehow to rephrase, because I quantify the level of damage. Quantify. Something like really economic assessment, not just environmental.
Delia?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I like Scott's language in the chat, but I think it needs to be by leaving segments of cables in situ versus removal. We're not talking about the whole cable.
Scott, Marion, can you maybe speak to your point that you made in chat?
Yep, just wanted to get language in there. So to the point that I raised earlier, instead of just a sort of binary comparison of which action minimizes damage, which in my mind would result in saying leaving the cable in place minimizes damage, and that's not what we want. My alternative would say demonstrating that the expected environmental damage from removing the portion of cable warrants leaving the cable in place. So it's essentially provide the justification for leaving it there.
Blake?
Yeah, I was just going to, say something similar to what Delia said about leaving the cables in situ. Would be portions of the cable, and then kind of address some of the things that Scott, you're saying. There are definitely going to be portions of the cable that we don't want to be removed, and that would be namely the portion of the cable that would be under the ocean shore. That would be the only way to really remove that portion would be to trench the beach and to remove it in that manner. And the trenching that would be required to get to the depth that the cable is at, which is, you know, anywhere between 60, 70 feet often, depending on the geology. I mean, you'd have to have some, you know, I'm not an engineer, but you would have to have an incredibly wide trench. It would be the removal of, you know, a lot of cubic yards of material, and it would be far more damaging than. So there are definitely going to be portions of the cable that we would want to remain in place because the damage would far outweigh the benefit of removal.
Thank you, Blake. Scott?
Scott, you're on mute if you're talking.
Thanks, Delia. Sorry. Just getting at Blake's point about are we trying to parse out the difference between the cable and the bore pipe under the beach? And I'm not sure about the technical capability, but I think you could pull the cable out of the pipe and remove it technically, and then it would be the pipe that would be left. So I don't know if we need to get into that level of detail about leaving infrastructure basically to distinguish between portions of cable.
Thank you, Scott. Blake?
Other point from what Scott, well, it's not a follow up on what Scott was saying, but section 2 here, where Steve has had DSL May approve the plan. You know, we have similar or very similar language in our easement document, and I would like it to see, you know, this section, you know, essentially mirror our language. What we say is that within 30 days, DSL shall either approve the plan, request revisions, or require additional information. So making it clear that it's, you know, DSL's sole discretion to approve that plan, to require revisions to that plan, or to require additional information.
Thank you.
And then, you know, Scott, that's a really good point about the bore pipe. We would still, you know, because it's, you know, something would require that whatever is remaining, you know, have some sort of authorization. It's an encroachment on state lands. So regardless if the cable is pulled out, if the bore pipe is there, if it's a thing, it's an encroachment and it requires authorization.
Thank you, Blake. Reed?
Yeah, I just had a question about this. It seems that most of these points are focused on the environmental impacts, which are clearly important, but I think part of the motivation for removing the cables is also to free up the seafloor for future installations. My sense is that if you leave sections of cable in the seafloor, that's going to be an area that has to be avoided for potentially replacing a cable route. So it seems like to some degree this is about balancing that interest with the environmental effects, because if it was purely environmental considerations, it may always be better to leave a cable buried in the seafloor rather than disturbing the seafloor again to remove it. So just wanted to throw that out there. Thanks.
Thank you, Reed. Scott McMullen?
Yeah, just to follow up on Jeff's comment in the chat, concrete mattresses have not ever been used in our area, and just the way we plan cables, it seems very, very unlikely that it ever would be done. So there's no, just want to make sure people understand, there's no concrete mattresses laying over cables anywhere in the state at this time.
Oh, maybe I misheard. I was talking to the people doing the PackWave project once, and I thought maybe I heard that was being used, but I might have misheard that. So, thank you.
It is a long ago practice, but yeah, I think Scott's right. DSL doesn't know of any mattresses over cables right now. That's not that's not our understanding.
Thank you. Okay.
Mike Graybill?
It's my understanding that concrete mattresses are used where a cable touches bottom from a floating structure. So they use rock emplacements for cable landings where you have a floating structure, such as a wind or a wave energy generating structure that has a cable that's descending from the surface to the bottom. At the cable touchdown point, oftentimes there's armoring or mattressing laid over it to avoid abrasion to the cable from the movement of the generating device that's at the surface.
So what I'm hearing is that this is a something that hasn't been used in Oregon, but based on what Mike just said, it is something that might be proposed with offshore energy.
Yes, but recognize that we're, as I understand it, discussing a section that's relating to telecommunications cables. So the information, if it's just undersea cables, then there is a prospect that these cable landings where they're descending from the surface to the bottom, there would be a calling because it is a routine practice to armor that landing point where the cable touches bottom. So that's the sea surface to ocean bottom nexus, as opposed to a transoceanic telecommunications cable that's going shore to shore. As Scott has pointed out, that's probably not a practice that would happen in the territorial sea here in Oregon because they avoid rock structures where that concrete matting would have been deployed. But these other technologies that involve cables would involve that armoring.
Thank you, Mike. Scott, is your hand raised? Oh, wait, no, it's not anymore. I see. Blake?
Yeah, I was just going to say, my understanding, Mike, I agree. There's definitely anchoring that's going to happen if you have a floating structure. And that's how I've always heard it referred to is anchoring. So not a good descriptor. So, depending on what they use, it may be a concrete mattress. It may be some other form of anchoring. But those are uses that are going to happen on the continental shelf and wouldn't involve, the territorial sea. It would just be that power cable as it passes through the territorial sea. I don't think there are leases being proposed, in the territorial sea. It's all outside of state jurisdiction.
Thank you, Blake. Mike?
When wave energy technology is developed, it's in high probability that those proposals will take place in the territorial sea because the waves are just as strong in the nearshore as they are in the offshore environment. And there is a difference between anchoring the energy generating device, in which the term anchoring is used, and securing for minimizing erosion and movement and abrasion, the power generating cable that's associated with that device. So there is, my understanding, there's no need to, there is some use of armoring and matting to hold anchor cables in place. And that technology is widely used. And there's companies all over the world that make those materials to lay concrete or rock rubble, lay over tops of anchor cables. But then there's also the power cables that also have their own armoring and protection devices. And if this document is in place and we have proposals from wave energy generating facilities, I would not rule out the possibility that those proposals would take place in the territorial sea.
Thank you, Mike. Jason Bush.
So I think I was going back to Jeff's question, would the policy apply to the concrete mattresses or not? I think it's clear that there is at least a possibility that we would see this usage. So the question still stands, if it does show up, does the policy apply to it? I guess I'm asking y'all what's the case?
Thank you, Jason. Delia?
I think my hope would be that at the beginning, where it says 471 undersea cables, that it could say the owner operator shall submit to DSL for approval a decommissioning plan to follow the processes for decommissioning cables and related infrastructure. I'll just float that out there. I think Laurel put something similar in the chat. I think that would be a good place to just put it at the beginning. We're talking about cables and related infrastructure. This would, we really can't use this policy to dial into that level of detail, in my opinion. I think this really has to be handled mostly on a case-by-case basis by DSL. Yes, in my opinion, yes, it's intended to cover all of the stuff that can be removed from the ocean should be removed from the ocean.
Thank you, Delia. Tara?
I think we will be discussing this perhaps later, Marcus, but making this decommissioning section apply actually to all projects, perhaps, or mirroring these for all projects so that it would cover all of these uses and infrastructure. So just want to flag that we might be coming back to this conversation somewhat.
Thank you, Tara. Yes, there were comments at OPAC that talked about, the question was, why do we not have similar decommissioning for other infrastructure that's in this level of detail as we have for undersea cables? So we will come back to that. Blake?
I was just going to point out in our easement, we define what needs to be removed as the whole system. We define, what that system is, the Jupiter cable system, the Bifrost cable system, whatever the cable system is. And, that decommissioning plan should be about the removal of the entire system. So that's how we see it. And that's the requirement in the easement. That said, I agree that, it's a little odd that we go into this amount of detail for just the cables, but not for any other use in the territorial sea. And, this decommissioning requirement is covered in statute and in statute already. It's handled in our easement template. So I really don't know if we need to get to this level of detail. So,
question for you, Blake. Does the decommissioning statute cover the system, and would it also apply to any other use of the seafloor?
I would have to look at what the language of the actual statute says, because I just don't have that in front of me. But my understanding is that it covers, it covers the whole kit and caboodle. But I'll look it up and get back.
That would make sense to me, because if we are allowing a private entity to come and use our seafloor for some purpose, when they're done with the project, it's consistent with how we treat other kinds of projects, that we would require the decommissioning and the reversion back as close as practicable to the habitats that were there previous. So
Yeah, in every one of our contracts, leases, licenses, easements, all those things, once it's terminated, the area has to be restored to its, previous condition. So regardless of whether we, even had this decommissioning, language, there was a requirement that, when they're done with it, they got to fix it and make it look nice, make it look like it used to before.
Thank you, Blake. Tara and then Natalia.
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful to see whatever Blake was referencing in terms of what language is in current easements, because this language was specifically added to the House bill because whatever we currently have was not considered sufficient. And so I think this level of detail now in statute for cables, at least, I think it's important that we do actually include this level of detail and would want to see it absolutely apply to any use beyond just cables. And I know we've mentioned a couple times maybe saying something like cable system or cable infrastructure. I think just making sure we're clear about our definitions and including any fixtures or other items that might be associated with any of these projects.
Thank you, Tara. Natalia?
I think we do need some details here. It just, this sentence should be rephrased a little bit. And also, Blake, correct me if I'm wrong. I think in current statute and previously, it just requirements for decommissioning. So we didn't require removal. And as discussion for this working group was that we need to require removal and only leave the portion of cables if it's like more damaging. The innovation here that we do require removal, and that's why we did those case studies with California and Washington, what their practice is and international practice, that the trend is going to remove the cable and only leave the part of that. So old statute or rules, they just require decommissioning. It's not the same as removal. So I think we need to have those details, but just clarify and rephrase maybe in different way, because the highlight is that we do require removal to free the space for other project on the seafloor. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalia. Tara?
Yeah, I know we're coming up on a break here and we've been at this one for a while. I just, again, wanted to flag that I'm struggling with separating this conversation from the one we're about to have on whether this section should be broadened to include everything. Not have this separate section just for cables. So I'm just struggling with that overall on how we're thinking about even this phrase if we're going to if our policy will be to expand this to every project or infrastructure or fixture.
Thank you, Tara. And that's a good point. I think what we'll do right now is since this is kind of a point where I think that we should maybe take a step back anyway, let's take a break about 4 minutes early and come back at 10:25. And we will jump into the next section of the potential change number 5, and we'll revisit this later when we talk about potentially the broadening the scope of it, and we can continue this discussion that we're having at that time.
Great, thanks, Marcus.
Absolutely.
We'll see you all soon.
Again. Thank you very much. So I have moved on to the next potential change, and we'll kind of loop back to potential change 4 a little later. This is the burial section. And this is so on the right hand side, the change is in it's highlighted with yellow, and on the right it is in red. The right is DOJ. So any thoughts on this section? Give you a moment to read through it.
Could you shrink the column on the left and expand the one on the right? It's hard to read the one on the right.
Sure. Oop. Let's see here.
If you got rid of the page views on the left column there, yeah, if you got rid of that page view and put it into slideshow mode or something.
Yeah, if I do that, then I lose the DOJ.
Yeah,
So
okay. All right, fine deal.
I want to have them both here, but I can zoom in a little bit and we can kind of look at this section.
Thank you.
Scott?
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. The only the DOJ changes I don't have any issues at all with. But something I guess I didn't I know I brought it up previously in working group meetings, but we still have it in here. It says shall be buried so as to achieve continuous burial. And while I probably one of the best records in the world in terms of overall burial in the fishing grounds off Oregon. The last time we checked and did an analysis, our burial rate in the fishing grounds, not just the territorial sea, but in the fishing grounds was 99.907% burial. So really, really good burial here in Oregon. However, it isn't continuous if the definition of continuous is complete burial end to end. And I just thought that, there could be a issue down the road as, they were talking earlier about institutional knowledge. There probably needs to be a clarification or a change of text so that continuous does not imply 100% burial, because there's very, very few cables are continuously buried with no exposures whatsoever. Sometimes we have some where there's a exposure that's about 1 meter long. It's called a hog's back, and it has to do with the amount of slack put into a cable. You have to put a little extra slack in. And in this particular case, it's in, I think it's around 250 fathoms of water. The cable arches up out of the trench and back into the trench, very, very short. But I just think we need to clarify that continuous doesn't mean 100%, or maybe we need to remove the word continuous and find another word like substantially buried or something that indicates, they do best efforts. And it's nobody's goal to have less than 100% burial, but it's just not realistic to require burial that is never less than 100%.
Thank you, Scott. Delia?
Apologies, I had too many mutes on. That's an interesting point, Scott. I always read that to mean like ongoing burial, like it gets buried and then it stays buried, as opposed to the extent of the burial, which I think is what you were getting at. So maybe there is another word that we could use, but I do think it's important to keep something in there that talks about an expression of, sustained burial or ongoing burial or perpetual burial or whatever works. But to me, that's the point, and I think it's an important thing to keep. I put an alternative to this paragraph in the chat. I think a couple of things. One is that since we removed the federal section and this is the territorial sea plan, I think we should remove in-state waters from the beginning of this paragraph. And then another is I see a need to kind of simplify this 1.1. And so I put a suggestion in the chat for how we could do that. The suggestion, the alternative language basically gets at that same continuous language, which could be altered if necessary. Unless the state finds that burial cannot be practicably achieved and that adverse effects of not burying the cable, pipeline, or fixture, which has to be removed. Apologies, that shouldn't have gone in there. It should just be adverse effects of not burying the cable have been avoided, minimized, or mitigated to the maximum extent practicable. So again, my goal is to kind of simplify it, clarify. We don't need in-state waters now that we don't have a federal section. This is the territorial sea plan. Simplify the language. Just like to ask the group to consider that.
Sorry, I'm trying to capture that, Delia. Let me try and add it here in this in the PowerPoint so that we have that language here. This is going to get messy real quick. So this is your proposed.
Except I made an error there at the bottom where it says burying the cable, pipeline, or fixture. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Well, maybe we should parse this into a couple of different topics specifically. And I think, Delia, your suggestion to remove in-state waters makes sense if we do not have a federal waters section. So I'd just like to poll the group really quickly. Is there any concern about us removing that in-state waters prefix to 1.1? I'm seeing thumbs up and
Yeah, this is Blake, sorry. I don't know if I have an issue with it, but I just want to make sure that, there's not going to be an interpretation that we're saying that everything seaward of extreme low tide, has to be buried, whether in the territorial sea or the continental shelf. So that would be my only concern, is that somebody would read this and say, we're trying to say that outside the territorial sea, it's got to be buried, or that's what this plan requires.
okay, well, I guess the solution in my mind is to see if NOAA responds negatively to our submission to them, that by removing this section, that's how they would read it. But because it is the territorial sea plan for the state, I think it's inferred that we're talking about in-state waters. Yeah, other than that, I got no issue with that change. Okay. And how do people feel about the different options on language then, if we're removing the in-state waters prefix? I think Delia's language is a little simpler. I think the effect is practically the same thing. So I would be open to taking the suggested language to Steve for his review. Tara, I see your hand go up.
Not sure if this is, I see Laurel's piping up in the chat on this point about the ocean shore, so wanted to make sure we flag that again. Laurel, did you want to speak to your concern?
I mean, the boundary of this excludes the ocean shore for the purpose of cable burial. We have it in our administrative rules that it would be, under the ocean shore. So maybe it's not an issue. I was just making sure he flagged that for review, and adding the definition of the ocean shore doesn't entirely cover my concern, or maybe it does by it just excludes it, I mean,
Right.
it already did, right, with the inclusion of the word ocean shore state recreation area, which is defined in statute. I guess I'm not sure if it addresses my concern by just defining it. Because sorry.
No. Yeah. Okay.
Does that make sense?
That's helpful. Thank you.
So my point was that it excludes it from the expectation of burial, and we have it in our administrative rules that it does need to be under the ocean shore. That was my concern, was just making sure that there isn't some conflict here by doing that.
I'm going to look to Andy. Is this a jurisdictional thing? Because we were trying to say, this is the territorial sea plan. So.
Well, my immediate gut reflex is, since Steve is the rep for State Parks Commission, as well as the DLCD, that he would have thought about the concerns from both perspectives. But I think we can raise this as a potential thing for him to analyze and come back to us with a response about this applies to the ocean shore recreation area as well as to the territorial sea, although it certainly might be a jurisdictional kind of boundary issue, that if you're talking about burial and we're limiting our territorial sea plan kind of jurisdiction to extreme high water or statutory vegetation line, sometimes does that cover all of the area that you're concerned about, Laurel? I'm not sure. So
well, there's only a portion of the ocean shore that overlaps the territorial sea, but right now it excludes it because it starts at extreme low water, which is the seaward extent of the ocean shore. So I'm not sure. I don't think it's an issue because they have it covered elsewhere. I just don't want it to be in conflict in some way.
Right.
Or to be confusing for somebody, to be like, oh, well, this doesn't say it has to be buried, so I can then trench on the ocean shore. For what I mean?
I think the point, though, that where the territorial sea plan's jurisdiction ends is into the ocean shore. So we don't want to wholly exclude it. We should just change that, as opposed to extreme low water, right? We would want it to be ordinary high. What is it? Ordinary high water line. What is the territorial sea definition? And so I'm not sure. Maybe just flagging this for Steve to make sure that we're covered from the territorial sea perspective. This again is sort of this weird thing where we want to nod to these other requirements, and that's why we formed the JART, because obviously parks and other are going to be there to say, yeah, and it has to be buried under the ocean shore. But let's just flag that maybe as a thing to maybe change the language there.
Thank you, Tara. Let's see, we have some hands raised. Delia, then Natalia.
Yeah, I hear you, Laurel. I think that's a really good point to raise. I just wanted to let everybody know that this is the language from the existing original Part 4, and so I think it totally warrants a little scrutiny to see if it actually covers all the areas. So thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you, Delia. Natalia, then Scott. Marianne?
Yeah, I support discussion regarding jurisdictional aspects, and here is also, I'm wondering, Marcos, why DOJ decided to put here just unless DSL find instead of state agency. So because as we were discussed, yes, territorial sea, but we also have this connection to onshore. We consider all cable system or infrastructure. So why here is just DSL find that the adverse effect of burial? It could be jurisdiction of other agency, and some other agency can propose something. So I'm wondering why DOG change from state agency to DSL, just responsibility.
Andy, you talked on this yesterday more eloquently than I can. Do you think you could talk about that change?
Yeah, so in general, as Steve was reviewing this version of part 4, he wanted to be very clear who the actors were. So applicants, the state, and in the case of the territorial sea plan, DSL is the owner of the territorial sea and is the actor by which, you know, we are convening the JART. They are the actor that has the authority to make the decisions. And so, you know, they are the one state agency that has the authority to implement these requirements. So there's no need to put somebody else there or another state agency there, since DSL is the state actor in the case of this process and or the decisions. And Steve was very clear about that.
Thank you, Andy. Scott Marion.
Hi, yeah. Well, I'm just wondering if we follow the prior logic of removing the federal part and saying it's implicit that this whole policy is applied to the territorial sea, can we just simplify this language and remove these jurisdictional questions and just say all seafloor cables shall be buried, and then the application is, you know, taken care of in other parts of the document and with the understood jurisdiction. So you know, and I noticed that Steve's edits, given the presence of our prior language that said, you know, seaward the extreme low tide, was to clarify the definition of ocean shore, you know, adding the ORS. But if all of that language is not deemed necessary here, it seems to me like it's kind of taken care of elsewhere.
So your proposal is to remove this section that I've highlighted here?
Well, I was looking at Delia's proposal there, but yes. But I would go so far as to say all the way back to, yeah, the language crossing the seafloor, it would just be all seafloor cables. I don't see that becomes ambiguous in any way. So that's just a thought, but others may have ideas on that. And if I may, while I'm speaking here, you know, to Scott McMullen's point about the standard of burial, you know, I totally agree that these small places where there may be some exposure I don't feel like are the sort of part of doing business, I think, with getting burial. But to the logic of how we want to frame this language, I guess my opinion is that it seems like the inability to achieve 100% burial everywhere is part of that evaluation that adverse effects, well, finding that burial cannot be practically achieved and that the adverse effects have been minimized. I feel like that is what we do when we shoot for total burial and the result is, well, there are too little places where it can't be 100%. The finding is we've done the best we can. We've minimized effects of non-burial. That's all fine. So I guess I would be reluctant to change the goal to say that the goal is ensuring continuous burial, but the evaluation of that in the finding can accommodate a little bit of non-burial as we do now.
Thank you, Scott. I just want to flag something else really quick. Steve did say that we should not have the word ensure in here, and that's why he changed it to achieve. So I think if we do adopt this, it should be shall be buried so as to achieve continuous burial. just wanted to bring that up since it kind of hit my radar. Let's see. Any other thoughts on this section? So thoughts on Scott Marion's potential change of just removing the section that I've highlighted here, following the logic that all of this talks about the territorial sea.
And to be clear, I'd want to make sure, Steve Shipsey weighs back in on that substantial change.
I guess I have a little bit of hesitation because the language that Steve provided, includes the rationale that would be used when making those decisions in the findings. And so generalizing it in the way that we've done here doesn't provide that additional context to an applicant as they are reading the plan. And I feel like it might be helpful for the applicant to have that there, to have the additional details. So, while I agree that I think simplification is good, and I think the changes that we've made inform kind of why we could simplify, I'm a little hesitant to go that route. So I do, but in general, I'm okay with the direction of the changes and the rationale for making those.
Delia.
Well, I mean, I hear you, Andy, and if it's important to keep the rationale, then I think that 511 needs a lot more wordsmithing. It's really like every time I read it, I have a slightly different interpretation. And so, if we can itemize what's important to people in the DOJ version, and then, do some sort of mashup, it just needs to be cleaned up. I just think it's kind of awkward. And I don't want, this is a very, very important section for ODFW, and I know for others as well. And so I want to make sure that when it comes time to implement, this is clear and we know what our guidance is and we know what we're allowed to call for. And I don't find that very clear.
Other thoughts on this section? I think I like Delia's suggestion of maybe itemizing what's important to people out of this, and trying to figure out a better way or a way to say it that is clear, because it seems like there's some confusion, or at least on what this section means, from what DOJ has written.
So I'd like to, focus a little bit on the language ODF&W provided. I think, Marcus, if you can edit out ensure to say to achieve and maintain continuous burial, I think that would be an improvement to that suggestion. I think the concept that Scott brought up of complete burial of all segments was different than the idea of continuous burial from a temporal perspective. I think both of those are important. Having, the knowledge that practicable comes into play when you're talking about the routing and all of the segments being buried. I think it's reasonable to think that in the future we may have some small segments that are not, that are exposed, but that, cable companies and the state are going to try and minimize those to avoid the fact that they come above the surface to minimize. And then if they can't do that, again, going through that mitigation framework that we have. So I think those to me are the important concepts that we want to have in this language. And I do think ODF&W's suggestion is pretty close to giving all of that.
I think it should also say instead of unless the state fines, it sounds like it should be unless DSL fines. Sounds like there was a pretty clear emphasis from DOJ on that.
So with those changes, and then there's still kind of on the table the change that Scott Merriam brought forward of removing this. I think that if we do, I mean, anything that we decide here is going to be sent to DOJ for review. So if there's an issue with this change, it'll be flagged. But how do people feel about changing that to remove this section that I have highlighted here? Under the idea that it's all in the territorial sea.
I agree. It's all on the seafloor.
Yeah, I think we should flag that for Steve specifically from the perspective of, does this, you know, meet our jurisdictional kind of ability? I think it does. You know, I'm swayed by the argument that was made. But I want Steve to make sure that, you know, when he's reviewing this, he's thinking about this from the perspective of both the territorial sea and the ocean shore.
Absolutely. So if there's no if there's no opposition to it, I'm going to delete this and I'll flag it to be compared to the one that DOJ sent and see what Steve has to say about it. Any dissent? I can't really tell. I can't see.
Hey, sorry, this is
Blake,
Marcus, this is Blake. I would say, you know, if we're going to put a line, it honestly should be, you know, mean high water, because that is the ownership line of the territorial sea. You know, the ocean shore recreation area goes from the vegetation line down to extreme, low tide, I believe, or extreme low water. So there's overlapping jurisdictions here. OPRD has jurisdiction down to extreme low water, you know, but that overlaps with DSL's ownership up to, you know, mean high water. So I would agree, like, remove this, you know, line, and, you know, it should be pretty clear. We're talking about the territorial sea. That is a known, you know, boundary. And, you know, I kind of feel like it confuses things to talk about the ocean shore recreation area.
All right. Thank you, Blake. Any other thoughts on removing this, or are we thumbs up on this portion? And then I'll talk to Steve about it. Okay, excellent. So this is the section as it looks now. Any other thoughts on this?
I like it.
Okay, great. I'm not seeing any other things. I guess I do want to kind of just circle back really quickly to Scott McMullen and see if this section of, you know, DSL fines the Bureau cannot be practically achieved hits to the point that you were making about continuous burial, and that the practicableness of it covers that.
Yeah, you know, I'll go along. I understand the state's intent. It's our intent as fishermen. You know, we have the fishermen that go on the ships. They push very hard for burial. If there's something that they feel like they can get deeper, they'll ask for jetting or whatever. But there are a few cases where there's just nothing can be done. So as long as there's this sense of reasonableness, I've got no problem with that.
Okay, thank you, Scott. All right. So if there's no other discussion on this point, I will move to the next. Might have to move some things around here. All right, so this goes to the communication and cooperative mechanisms, and we can jump down to that. So the original is not highlighted, and it's on the left-hand side. The proposed change that was brought to OPAC is highlighted in yellow on the left, or on the right. And on the left, it's the section 5, and those are the changes that were made by DOJ. Go ahead and take a moment to read through those, and if you have any thoughts, just raise your hand. Mike Graybill?
Is there a reason why cultural resources are left out of this section? I'm kind of lost in this. Is there a separate one for cultural resources? Because if there isn't a separate section, it would seem appropriate that the whole process that's described under this communication and cooperative mechanisms might also address cultural resources.
Well, Mike, I guess my gut response is I don't think that was intentionally left off. And then do you have a suggestion about where you would add cultural resource? I mean, the last sentence is where my eye goes when I think
That's
about
where
adding cultural.
That's where mine goes. You know, when you got the list like that, damage to the seafloor, then, I mean, that's typically where cultural resources would be flagged. But unless there's a separate consultation and a whole other separate section for addressing cultural resources, then it would seem worthy to include those here. And those cultural resources are more likely to be in the territorial sea than they would be in U.S. jurisdictional waters.
Thank you, Mike. Delia?
Yeah, can you scroll up, Marcus, to Steve added a 2.4 for tribal to his,
Yep.
And so I think that was Steve's attempt to get at the same. So Mike, could you take a look at that and see if so that would be up in the background section. Does that get at it?
Well, it gets to the consultation part of it, but this doesn't necessarily talk about dispute resolution. Which number 5 on the right-hand side, or potential changes 6, kind of gets to how disputes will be resolved.
Okay.
I mean, if it said damage to natural or cultural resources, or damage to natural or other resources.
I'm reluctant to mash tribal concerns in with anything else, just as a general practice.
Well, I would agree as well, but
yeah.
the cultural resources don't have to be tribal. Could be a sunken vessel, a historic ship or something like that. So if it's just damage, it doesn't have to flag it as tribal cultural resources, because there are other cultural resources that may be worthy of protecting that would require some means of resolving disputes about how they should be protected. I would be happy with just throwing in damage to natural or culturally significant resources. Because, I mean, basically, fishing is a culturally significant resource of today. It's anyway.
Delia, is your hand raised?
Legacy, apologies.
No, no worries. Just want to make sure I get everybody.
So I guess I feel pretty comfortable with making that change. And I would like to just get the rest of the groups kind of pulse on this. Because I agree with Mike that, you know, cultural resources are not necessarily tribal cultural resources. So having a broad envelope there and having this be in the section that, you know, written agreements or documentation can cover kind of the fact that those have occurred. And I think in general, the state wants those to have occurred between an applicant and other entities. To me, that's an improvement, but yeah, I think Delia and Scott, I'm not sure which one of you had your hands up first.
Scott, go ahead.
Sure. Well, the addition of cultural to natural resources there raised my recollection of conversation we were having at ODFW about concern over the presence of damage to natural resources in that section 5. I guess my thought is it's not really for a written agreement between the applicant and fishers or other users to be evaluating damage to natural resources. That's the role of the review by ODFW and the JART and others. There, you know, those written agreements might address those topics, but I guess I'm wondering if that needs to be pulled out of that section. That these written agreements section is really about, you know, spatial use conflicts and that sort of thing. But Delia, correct me if I'm misrecalling where we
No, thanks for hitting on that, Scott. We did talk about that in terms of like the role of this policy versus land management, natural resource management, so on and so forth. So I agree with you on that point. I also think, I don't know if Jeff is still with us, but I don't know if that language, damage to natural resources, might be too vague for federal consistency criteria. Yeah, so I guess our suggestion would be that it just read damage to seafloor utilities or liability for such actions, which is similar to the original part 4, I think. And if we're going to bring in cultural, I would think that that should be a separate section.
Scott, Marion, then Blake. Blake.
Sorry, left my hand up.
Oh, okay, Blake.
So just thinking out loud, who would the applicant enter into an agreement with for damage to natural resources? You know, I mean, I would imagine it would be with the state. I mean, there's not a private entity out there that, you know, they would need to enter an agreement to, you know, resolve disputes about damages to natural resources, because the, you know, the public, i.e. Oregonians, own those natural resources and the state manages them in trust. So I don't, yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think out loud here. So I get the disputes over lost fishing gear, the damage to seafloor utilities, but the natural resources, that should be handled through the easement agreement and the other permits, you know. You know, for example, when the Jupiter cable had the, you know, the unrecovered materials, we issued a fine of $250,000 under the under our easement for damages to the seafloor. So I'm not really certain if we would even like what written agreement we would consider that would kind of, unless I'm missing something. So happy to be corrected.
Thank you, Blake. Jeff?
Blake, that's a really good question. Where my mind went was that crabs themselves are natural resources. And so if there is an action that takes place that is detrimental to a crab population, and there may need to be some sort of mitigation agreement for the effect that has on a fishery as a protected use, that maybe this could be a mechanism to get at that. But then my next thought went, well, is that DSL standing to enter into that? If this whole section has now been focused on what is under DSL's jurisdiction to require, this might not be the right place for that kind of conversation, and it might open a can of worms.
Thank you, Jeff. Mike Graybill?
Well, I wouldn't disagree with the perspective that these are managed in natural resources are managed in trust. The example that Jeff flagged of crabs, for example, if you look at the discussion that's going on right now with offshore wind, the principal conflict is with the fishing community. And if you ask a crabber or the commercial fishing industry or the seafood processing industry, they take high levels of proprietary interests in those natural resources. And they take action and identify conflicts as though those crabs belong to them. Yeah, they're certainly managed in trust by the state, but there are private interests who would be the focal point of conflicts. And I think that's what I see this communication and cooperation section is designed to flag constituents that have vested interests in natural resources and make sure that it's not DSL's responsibility to have to resolve that. DSL wants to make sure that if they've got an applicant that's proposing to do something to the seabed that has an impact on natural cultural resources, that the applicant has demonstrated that it's reached out to those constituencies for which there would be a conflict and has mapped out a pathway to resolve disagreements, disputes over those resources.
Thank you, Mike. Blake?
Yeah, I was, just going to follow up, when discussing about crabs, I completely understand the fishing industry has a vested interest in it. So maybe the focus should be on, economic impacts to those ocean users or people who experience economic impact to, effects to natural resources or something like that. But I do feel like, when we're talking about damage to natural resources, if we're talking about crabs, I feel like ODF and W would have more standing than we do as far as, talking about damages to those resources. The public trust doctrine specifically states that, the state owns the living resources within the waters, excuse me, of the state. So, I mean, I would contend that ODF and W, if you're talking about crabs, would be the one to talk to about, damage to natural resources or, having some sort of written agreement. So, I don't know. I'm not trying to overcomplicate things, but I do see that, for me, there's a little bit of an issue here for damage to the natural resources. Who would we have that written agreement with?
Thank you, Blake. Delia?
Yeah, all really good points. Mike, I hear you. I think what's important to us about this paragraph is that there be documentation, that DSL collect that documentation, that those conversations occurred, and that both sides of that conversation agree to the content. of that conversation. Where I get uncomfortable is statements like this that imply that that documentation therefore can be held up as like, see, we fixed it all. This is now we don't need it. You know, that's not, and the damage to natural resources I see as an overreach. I think it's, of course, I completely agree with you 100%. Our fishing industry participants are very invested in sustainable fisheries and practices and sustainable natural resources to support them. But the agreement itself, the documentation would specify how fishers and the applicant will resolve disputes. I mean, I guess maybe we remove resolve disputes and just say content of the conversation or something else like that. But if we're resolving disputes, then it needs to be something over something that the user controls. The lost fishing gear, the applicant controls the utility, and the future of that discussion. So I don't know if that helps or just confuses things, but we need to keep it as written documentation of what those two parties are involved in.
Thank you, Delia. Tara, then Andy.
Well, I'd like to hear what Andy has to say because he might be responding directly to Delia's comments. So
I guess what I'm hearing in this conversation is sensitivity over the damage to natural resources calculation that is a part of some of this, you know, agreement about how these two parties who have an interest in beneficial uses of the ocean are going to coexist, right? And you know, the statement that, you know, that they shouldn't be the ones dictating what those are and or what the actions would be to cover liability in that regard. So, you know, one suggested modification here is to remove and focus on the example that is, you know, more clear, which is the specification of how fishers and or other users will resolve disputes over damage to gear, damage to the utilities, or other losses accrued by the parties who are involved in this agreement. So I guess would that kind of a change help to alleviate some of the concerns that I'm hearing?
Would for me.
I'm seeing a thumbs up from Scott. Blake, I'm curious as to how you would.
Andy, I'm very apologetic. I was getting a bunch of team messages.
No problem.
I'm so sorry. Can you please repeat that?
My comment was to change the last portion of the last sentence that is, I think, the source of the concern in this instance, and that's some sort of agreement about damage to natural resources or the liability therein, and to limit this sentence to a damage to the interest of either party who's a part of the agreement.
Yep, I like that. Thank you.
Okay. So if we're comfortable with that kind of a change, then I think, you know, Marcus and I can work on maybe it's just removing that last piece of the sentence to clarify that that's really all that documentation should cover. I see Mike's hand go up, and I think Scott, maybe you were first. So.
Yeah, I just agree with you, Andy. I mean, in context, this is talking about communication that may be considered by DSO. It's something that happens before this thing even starts. So there won't be any damage to natural resources to talk about before this starts. And if there is some damage down the road, in the case of Jupiter, for example, then DSL has mechanisms for taking care of it. So I think we're spending a lot of time here. Your fix is perfect, Andy. Let's just strike that last couple words out and move on.
Mike?
Just seeking clarification to know if cultural resources are included in Andy's suggestion.
Yeah, I don't think that the way that this section is written, cultural resources would be precluded from being, you know, a conversation that's had and could be documented through written evidence.
My understanding is that if there are specific things listed in a rule or statute, and there's an absence of reference to other similar kinds of activities, that absence, lawyers interpret that as intentionally left out. So if you're making a list of the kinds of things and an item like cultural resources is not included on the list, my understanding is that courts interpret that, the intent of that, as to having excluded it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Mike.
I mean, could
What
we
I'm-
just
what-
say
yeah, what I'm
including but
balancing.
not limited to?
Yeah.
Sorry to talk over you, Andy.
No problem, Blake. Yeah, I was reading the first sentence in this section and wondering whether other users could qualify as users of a landscape or a geography that has cultural meaning. So thinking that it could be included in the first sentence. And then my thought is the last sentence was specific to documentation about a very specific agreement between the cable industry and the fishing industry, which I think we do want to be inclusive about and have the language, because that's been one of the most important components of cable routing and siting to date. So I guess I was wondering whether or not deleting the last sentence entirely is appropriate, because if you don't say anything about that, then the first part of the paragraph still applies and would cover the needs. But
or even removing this, towards just like how you fishers or other users and the applicant will resolve disputes or liability for such actions.
that seems to be a clearer, and it doesn't include a specific example, which would then allow you to include the idea of cultural resources. So I think that's a good potential solution, Marcus.
There were some other folks with their hands raised. Delia, then Tara.
Yeah, I just, Marcus, when you showed us the timeline earlier, it looked like, yeah, you're going to be working with the tribes this week or next week or soon. Could you flag this for that discussion and ask whether they think they should have another section here? Because I'm just really uncomfortable making any decisions here without having any tribal representatives here. So
Yeah, I can make note of this conversation and flag that for the tribes for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Tara.
I just wanted to note again that this is not just about cables, correct? So I heard that from Andy, and I know that that's always in our mind when we're thinking about these, but this is about, pipelines and other uses of the seafloor. So just want to be clear about that. I'm not sure if that changes anything here, but concerned that we don't want to narrow this to only thinking about fishers and an applicant, or so I'm just struggling a bit with this one. I also don't think that we should only be thinking in terms of economic interests when it comes to other users, and how disputes will be resolved. It's not necessarily about economics. So I know that that's probably top of mind for some of the coastal residents. I'm not sure if Lene is on to speak to any of that.
Thank you, Tara. Natalia.
Well, initially I thought, that probably I would leave damage to resources, but I was thinking too, maybe we can substitute natural with the marine resources, because marine resources are more broadly, and again, as Tara pointed out, we are not talking just about cables. Opak raised this question about artificial coral reefs. And marine resources could include reefs as well, but marine resources can also include renewable energy. So I don't know if, probably not cultural, but it's more broad than natural resources. And we don't know what things will come up with, and marine resources also cover ecosystem, biological ecosystem that could be related to crab issue that was raised before. So it's just more broad, and we do need to include damages to some resources, because we don't, and liability for such actions, because we don't know what other issue will come up from utility pipelines and offshore wind energy. At least from the experience from European countries like Denmark, Netherlands, and United Kingdom, offshore wind energy, there is a huge first #1 conflict. This is between fishery and communities, and damaging the resources. So I would not eliminate that completely. I mean, to make it general, yes, I mean, we can adopt that Marcus proposed if we delete like those overlost fishing gear damage to seafloor utility, if we delete completely all those things. To make it more general, that we can add an interpretation, that could be the option. But if we leave this, I would not delete damage to natural resources, but I would just maybe replace to marine resources. It's just thoughts for discussions. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalia. Mike Graybill.
I support the fact that if we deleted, as you suggested, Marcus, that would address Delia's concerns. One of the concerns I have about this, keeping tribal interests separate, is that tribal interests are cultural interests, and I completely appreciate the sensitivity that public agencies have about this. But I think keeping cultural interests separate from contemporary cultural interests, tribal cultural interests separate from contemporary cultural interests, is an artificial distinction. I mean, we've flagged fishing damage, lost fishing gear. Fish are culturally significant resources. They're just culturally significant, not only to tribal interests, but also to contemporary interests. So I really support the deletion of that specificity in that last sentence, as Marcus has proposed. That will address Delia's concerns, because then it doesn't flag tribal, or it certainly doesn't distinguish tribal interests from it. And it will eliminate the need when you get together with the tribes to even talk about this issue, because it includes tribal interests.
Thank you, Mike. Blake, then Lene, and just to put it out there, we have about 4 minutes until our scheduled lunch break. So let's we can come back to this conversation after lunch, but I'd like to hear from Blake and Lene beforehand, if we can.
Thank you. I was just going to say, I really don't see how this last sentence isn't just an extension of the previous one, where it's, talking about such agreements or other documentation and describe what those agreements or documentation would look like. And then we have another sentence that specifies more what that written documentation is going to include. So I like Delia's suggestion of just removing the last sentence and specifying procedures for ongoing communication and dispute resolution. And I would, to Mike's point, I totally understand that you want to include the damage to natural resources, et cetera, but I'm just thinking logistically as like a contract, when I see who is this applicant going to enter into an agreement with damage to, natural resources or liability for such actions. And in my mind, that is more appropriate, that agreement would be more appropriate with the state agency. With DSL, they would need an agreement with us, which is the easement that would, describe how they would, how we would resolve disputes about damages to the natural resources and the liability for such actions. Because, our easement document specifically talks about those two things. Who's liable for, the actions that take place in the easement parcel? The applicant is. And what happens when there's damage to natural resources, then we have a process for that. So to me, it just seems very circular, and perhaps I'm just not seeing the point exactly, but yeah, that's where I'm coming down on. So thank you.
Thank you, Blake. Lene?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I just have two really short comments. One is what Tara had been talking about, and she said maybe Lene wants to weigh in on this as well. Indeed, it's not just economic impact. And I think we found that with Jupiter, but I think we're going to keep thinking about that as we move forward. So I would not want to just say economic impact. The second one is having been involved with mutually respectful relationships with tribal governments over my career. I know that they did not have a representative on this work group, and it wasn't because people didn't try to get them, but I think respectfully taking this to them and having them weigh in on how do they want to be referred to, and is it just a tribal issue, is it a cultural issue? I think we're going to gain a lot by having that conversation. But those are my only two comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Lene. So we're gonna break for lunch and we'll come back to talk about this and maybe get to a consensus point after public comment. So we'll break from now until 12:30 and then we'll have a public comment and we'll get right back to this after that time. So I will see you all in about an hour.
Thanks, everyone.
Welcome back, everyone. I would like to take this time to address any public comments there may be. If you have a public comment that you would like to share, please raise your hand and we will get to you. We'll give it a couple of minutes just in case we have some people coming in late, just to make sure that there's room for that. If we don't have any public comments in the next couple of minutes, we'll kind of go back to the last point that we were talking about. And if anyone has a public comment after this time, they can let us know. We can maybe make time for it a little later, but I don't want to hold up the meeting. just really quickly, in case anybody joined us since, we're now moving into the public comment section. So if you have any public comment that you'd like to make, please raise your hand. All right. I'm not seeing any. If anyone comes in and has public comment in a bit, we can address that. But I'd like to move back to where we were, which I think was this communication and cooperative mechanisms. Let me change my screen sharing so that I am sharing my entire screen. So I think that we were at a point where we could probably make, have a consensus vote on just removing either this section or removing this whole last sentence. Does anyone else have thoughts about the communication and cooperative mechanism section, or that they'd like to discuss before we move on to that? Andy?
Yeah, hi. Delia had a suggestion in the chat of a small amendment to the sentence that ends ongoing communication. And I liked that addition. So I was supportive of deleting the last sentence and modifying that statement. I don't have a chat open here. It says for ongoing communication and dispute resolution was the suggested change. So that is what I think we should try and have a consensus motion on.
All right, so the consensus motion is deleting this last sentence and adding to the end of ongoing communication and dispute resolution. Is there any, I guess it's easier to ask if there's anyone opposed to that.
No opposition here.
I'm not seeing any hands raised. So, all right, I'll make note of that and we can make that change. Let's move on to the next potential change. This is, this was something that was brought forth to OPAC, and OPAC had some, that they had some pretty strong feelings, I think, on keeping directly out of the TSP throughout, whenever it says within or affecting, and previously it has said within or directly affecting the territorial sea. I think the consensus at OPAC was to keep things more broad and not limit the state's power. But I wanted to bring that suggestion back.
Guess what plane?
Yeah, those are all ready.
Okay, fine.
Lene, can you mute?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I can't tell if I'm muted or not.
Excellent. Do we have any thoughts on that change, the potential change that was brought to OPAC and their response to that?
I just had a quick question. Tara, I know Elaine was the individual who was working on this language with us. Have you had any further communications with her about how this change was viewed by her constituents or the people she was working with?
We had a conversation after OPAC. Unfortunately, she was not able to make it today. And she understood OPAC's direction here. I think we understood that, they wanted to limit it only to direct effects from the industry perspective, but that OPAC was pretty clear about wanting to make sure that we did not limit our jurisdiction or limit the scope of how our enforceable policies would apply. So we did have a subsequent conversation with her since she was not able to make this meeting and explain that.
Thank you, Tara. That's very helpful.
Any other thoughts on this? Otherwise, we can move on. I'm not seeing anything. So I think this is the slide, and I'm going to just minimize this here and make this larger for folks to see. We'll just do this. So these were some notes from OPAC, some comments that were made. And I don't know who all here was able to make it to the OPAC meeting. I was there. It was very hard for me to hear, so I had to kind of lean on Andy and Tara for their interpretation of what was said there. But this is a list of some of the things, and I know that this kind of brings back, you know, kind of goes back to some of those 7 parts that we've already talked about. I showed a flow chart at OPAC, and I have that here in the slides, and I will show that to you in a moment. But I guess first we'll discuss about whether the objectives were in priority order and if we should add clarifying language to that. That was something that was brought up at OPAC. Thoughts to this?
Marcus, I was just wondering, maybe there's a process suggestion for actually going through these in a little bit more of an order, because I think just having people see the broad list
Sure.
Is
sure.
hard
Yeah.
to get a specific opinion on, since there's potentially a lot to cover.
Yeah. Let me bring that the DOJ document back up, because we can kind of look at the draft as it fits with everything. Let me make this a little bit smaller so we can read everything, and bring this back up, and we'll go back up to the objectives.
And Jason had his hand raised, so maybe he was responding to your question. Go ahead, Jason.
Well, you hit it. One was, I thought we should at least see those, put our eyes on them, and ask the question, whose priorities? The state's, what's the definition of priority?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the intention originally was to not have these be in any kind of priority order, and have them all be equal. So I think, but there was question at OPAC whether some of these should have greater priority or not. I don't think it was mentioned which one should or which one shouldn't. And I guess that's what we're discussing today. As far as I guess it would be from the state's perspective, like, what's the priority of the state?
Well, that really goes back to the foundational goal of ocean resources management in the state of Oregon, which is goal 19. So, we do have a priority preference expressed in goal 19, with then an acknowledgement of the many other uses of the ocean. I'm not going to walk through all of those, but I don't think we have to go out of our way to list that, because it is in the goal, and these are all objectives, I think, that are in furtherance of meeting our goal as a state. So I guess I was not sold on the idea of trying to put these into a priority, because it depends upon the situation that you're in. And it's hard to generalize, and come up with that prioritization order, I think, when many of these overlap in some ways. And so I think you'd end up getting into a semantic argument about overlaps and which one is which. And I think the state does have, a framework already in goal 19.
Thank you, Andy. Delia, and then Tara.
We're not hearing you, Delia.
Thank you. To repeat, I agree with Andy, and I just wanted to add too that that this amendment to Part 4 broadens and expands the content in Part 4 so dramatically that I don't think it would be a good thing to have any sort of priority in here, because to me, the value in broadening it is that we're trying to cover all of these things in here, and they don't need to be in order of preference. They should just be covered. So that's it.
Thank you, Delia. Tara?
Sorry, I should clarify. The discussion at OPAC was not about there was a question about whether these were in priority order and whether or not it was made clear that they're not, whether there should be clarifying language to that effect, that these are not in any sort of priority order. That was the discussion at OPAC. So not whether or not to prioritize them. I think it was a clear understanding that these are not in priority order, but do we need to add any language to make that clear? That was the discussion.
I hear you. Thank you, Tara. So maybe just adding something to clarify in this beginning sentence that just states that, you know, identifies the following objectives. I don't know how to word that right now off the top of my head. Blake, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to suggest, you know, the following objectives to be achieved listed in no particular order. I mean, I feel like we should make it simple and not overthink it.
Thank you, Blake. Delia?
I would prefer to just leave it as is. I don't want to state whether or not there's any priority, because as Andy talked about, the priorities are already identified in goal 19. If there's future changes to this policy or other policies or the statewide planning goals, I don't want to get hamstrung on whether or not this expresses some sort of policy or explicitly states that it doesn't. I think we should just leave it as is.
Thank you, Delia. Tara?
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know that the language here needs to be changed, but there was just discussion from OPAC, and we said we would bring that to the working group. I think if anything that might be helpful is, you know, these are not numbered, they are lettered though, which is some sort of order. Maybe they should be bulleted with that, you know, I don't know that that helps, but maybe it just expresses them more as these are the following objectives. You know, you don't need it, and then silent, there's no order, but maybe that would be helpful, because I think even the lettering might have given the impression that there was some order to these.
Yeah, on a very small counterpoint, and generally I agree, I think that there is value in having the ability to reference a specific objective in the plan. And I've had other, you know, project applicants for grants and things reference specific objectives as a part of a state plan when they're justifying, you know, a project that they want to complete. So I would like to keep the lettering. I think it's a specific choice not to have them numbered, and I think that should say something in and of itself. So I would prefer to keep it as is. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, and thank you, Tara. Natalia?
I would leave this as it is, because if we want to establish priority, then we would add language like first priority, it would be that or that. I think it's logical. First, we want to protect, we want to implement, and we want to engage community and facilitate coordination and cooperation. A, B, C, D, it's logical. And the last things, any goals, whatever we have, any goals or objectives, they usually, this is the list of things that we want to achieve at the end. And there is no specific priority. So this is just what the results we want to get in the end. That's all. And they depend on the complexity of the project case by case. So I would leave this like this, because we already agree, we discussed during the H meetings, not come back to this. Thank you.
Marcus, I'm hearing consensus.
Yeah,
Keep it as it is. I feel like let's
Given
move.
we have like an hour left, we
Yep.
should probably move.
Excellent.
But I hear consensus on just leaving it as is, and we can explain that at OPAC.
That sounds great. So we'll move on to the next, and there was support at OPAC for adding a version of this flow chart, and I'll kind of blow this up here a little bit so that we can see it. I don't know if that's big enough. Let me just do this and maybe people can see it a little bit better. But adding this in maybe an appendix or somewhere within the document, so that we can kind of see the flow of how things go. That was brought up at OPAC. Are there any thoughts on adding this, or you know, adding it to the document? I also plan on adding it to, you know, a website, but I think it should be in the document itself. Delia?
Sorry, struggling with my buttons here. I like the idea of adding it, but I only saw it for the first time at the OPAC meeting, and then I haven't seen it since, I don't think. So could we have a little bit of time to look through it and just
Absolutely.
make sure for accuracy's sake? Thanks.
Oh, I'll just go away
And
from it, I guess, accidentally.
Just for a little bit of background on how this came to be. This was a product, it's an appendix that already exists to the Oregon Renewable Energy Siting Assessment Project that DLCD and the Department of Energy conducted. That work was to understand and identify early communication coordination opportunities associated with renewable energy planning and siting. The territorial sea was one of the geographies within which we wanted to provide that background information. And so Department of Energy led a process with multiple agencies to produce this diagram. So it should be accurate because all of the natural resource agencies contributed to this. So unless things have changed recently, this should be accurate. It's also, you know, it's available online. We can send that link around, and it is accompanied by a paragraph or two that describe the process overall. So, you know, I struggled thinking about how and where this gets puts into the chapter, and then language that would need to be added to kind of describe how and where it fits and why. So I'm almost to the side of having this as an informational document that's separate from the territorial sea plan that exists in the place where you would find a permit application or others as a guiding document, and not trying to incorporate this in at the last minute here, because it really was created for a different purpose and has value in and of itself for that project.
I guess to clarify, Andy, this has been remade, and this is very specific to part 4. There are added sections to this. It's so this is taken from the same format as the other one, but this has been completely remade specifically for part 4. Like, for example, like adding identifying affected jurisdictions is in here. You know, having the other state agencies invited in the beginning. You know, originally it was state agencies and local for the other. So there's been quite a lot of changes to make this very tailored to part 4. There are hands raised, I believe. Sorry, Natalia.
Yeah, it's me. I'm wondering, Marcos, like the first bullet requires pre-application meeting, and I think that was also mentioned at OPAC meeting that we need to have some more rules for and the process how those pre-application meeting would be required. So this bullet, I don't see the arrow that it's connected to somewhere. As my understanding, and we discussed that applicants would require pre-application meeting with the first contact of point as DSL. And DSL later on, we plan to develop a guidelines for pre-application meeting for applicants, how it should be, and etc. at the later stage. At least I put this in my plan by the end of August. But here is, we have this bullet requires pre-application meeting, and it's like separate. It doesn't connect it to something else. I mean, with arrows and lines. It's like sitting there and then invited other state agency, and that's all. But it should be like connection after that, conduct pre-application meeting, or at least, I don't know, some line areas to DSL, that DSL is the first contact point for that. So it seems like it's a little bit separate and no other explanation. Requires pre-application meeting, but there is no rules from whom requires and how to do that. So maybe we can add something more clarity there. And also another issue, it's related only to part 4. We discuss and Apak this question, JART conversion between part 4 and 5. If it's, let's say, this is offshore wind energy project, I'm wondering, should we reflect somehow, maybe add one more square or explanation in this chart, flow chart, if it's necessary to convert, to do that with part 5. Yeah, this is a to concern. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalia. Laurel?
I'm leaning towards Andy's direction, even though it sounds like this was modified for the specific purpose of having it be sort of a standalone thing that we can, because the process isn't completely outlined and set up completely yet. If we put it in the territorial sea plan and then something's tweaked about the process, or I do see it as a helpful reference. So it could be maybe, like Andy suggested, a standalone document. And if not, how I don't see other permitting processes sort of integrated in here in any way or referenced. I don't know if that would, the plan was to have some accompanying text that does that, but right now this is primarily the DSL process, and there's, you know, the ocean shore alteration permit and other processes that are connected. So it just need to be clear that it isn't all by itself, and we haven't worked out all those, how that's going to be streamlined or yet. So that's why I was deferring towards Andy's suggestion of keeping it as a helpful reference, but maybe as a standalone document, so it could be modified as necessary as the process is more clearly outlined in the future.
Thank you, Laurel.
I
Any
think
other-
I think that sounds good. And that way, I mean, this is mostly to help, I think, applicants understand the process, right? I don't know that it's important for the state to have in our plan. So I think it's fine as an informational item attached, you know, to, or somehow included within the website and reference materials for part 4.
Yeah, and DSL will develop guidelines anyway for the applicants, how to do this process. So it would be separate, and that we can adjust in terms of policy change or something else.
Excellent. So I think I'm hearing a lot of support for having this not be attached to the TSP part 4 and having it as a separate kind of guidance document. Right, I am seeing agreement with that. Is there anyone who is opposed to that? I'm not seeing anything. So we will move on to the next one. And the next one is, well, there was a recommendation to provide a petition process for those parties not invited to the JART. So if some, you know, if DSL, you know, kind of fails to identify a party that feels that they're an affected user, that there should be some way for them to petition to be part of the JART as long as DSL retains the final say in the JART composition. Do we have any thoughts on that? I'll go down to the JART section. Blake, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, my just initial thought here is that when we go through the rulemaking process, we could add that in to, you know, OAR as part of the JART process, is that, you know, those people who feel like they are affected ocean users can petition to either the agency, their state land board, or something like that to be a part of it. I guess, you know, long story short, happy to, you know, have that kind of petition process in there, especially if the group feels like it's beneficial.
Any other thoughts on that? Thank you, Blake. Delia?
I think a rulemaking would be a better place for this than in part part 4.
Thank you, Delia.
Yeah, I was gonna say pretty much the same thing as Delia just said. I think it's a good idea. I think it's valuable to have and an option for our public to ensure that they have an opportunity to engage. I don't think it's that we need to put that level of detail in our description of the chart.
So I guess to kind of wrap in another point that was made later is a discussion about whether to add general timelines for agency response to an application. I think that these kind of things all kind of fall under a similar umbrella. You know, having this petition process, having the flow chart, having, you know, because I think a lot of those are going to be coming down to DSL, you know, DSL's rules and like potential OAR changes. I just kind of wanted to bring this point up because it seems very similar to those previous points in that I don't know that the TSP is the place for these general timelines. Just like it may not be the place for this petition process. Those are just, that's my thought on it. Yeah, rulemaking. Any thoughts on what I just had to say?
I see
I think-
Delia and Kelly and then Joanne.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
I was just gonna say, I think anything that is specific to DSL should be in DSL's rulemaking. And I don't
Thank
know
you.
for sure. I don't know for sure if the timelines and what are the other things, the process, the steps, the parties involved is going to be identical for all of the different industries that we're trying to cover in part 4. So I don't know. I feel like this isn't the right place for that.
Excellent. Thank you, Delia. Blake?
Yeah, was just going to say the same thing. Petition process, those timelines, those type of specifics should be handled through rulemaking. There will be, you know, rules advisory committee. There'll be public comment, a public hearing. You know, plenty of chances for the public and not just the rules advisory committee to weigh in on what that petition process would look like, or whether general timelines should be added for, you know, an easement application. You know, typically that's not, you know, when we're talking about proprietary authorizations like easements and leases, we don't put a timeline because they may involve negotiating terms and conditions for the easement. Perhaps the applicant wants to see some terms changed, and you know, that can extend the process. So I guess that's just a general caveat for the timelines, you know, comment. But I think a lot of this should be resolved through rulemaking and not through the plan, just because, you know, the plan is not you know, statute or rule, and doesn't, you know, yeah, it shouldn't contradict that. So that's all I'll say. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Blake. Joanne?
Yeah, so I wanted to say that I agree that this level of detail would not be appropriate in the plan, but it is extremely important for the applicant to understand timelines. So if that is addressed in the rulemaking, then that's great. If it can be transcribed to that flow chart, since we agreed that that would be a separate document, even at a high level, just to get an idea of the timelines involved with reviewing documentation that is submitted to the agencies, I think would be very important to the applicant, so that they can factor in the timelines into their plan of work. You know, these, in the case of me, you know, I'm representing subsea cables, very costly and critical infrastructure, and it is really important that the timeline for permitting is well understood before, you know, to factor in when the cable will be made, when it'll be put on ships, when it'll be installed. These types of things are very expensive, and it's very important that we have an understanding of the timelines.
Thank you, Joanne. Tara?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify the discussion at OPAC around timelines. We went through this exact conversation that it would not be specific timelines, but a general timeline. I think the flow chart would be a perfect place to put that as sort of a, DSL, or, the state expects this to take whatever, 6 to 18 months, however you, I believe there was mention that there might be something to this effect in part 5, so we can check that. But it was more about just a general broad timeline, not getting into the nitty gritty on like DSL will have 60 days to review an application, et cetera, but more that broad, how long are we approximating, knowing that every project is different. But I think the flow chart, now that we've decided that's going to live outside the plan, could be a good place to just have a general statement to that effect, and would defer to DSL and the agencies on what that timeline would be arranged.
Thank you, Tara. Jason Bush.
Yeah, just on this issue of timelines, I think it's pretty clear that the specifics belong in rulemaking. However, what I would note, kind of the flip side of the coin, that Joanne's comments is what I'd not seen in this new set of rules or policies is any reference to sort of expeditious processing of applications. I think it's important, of course, to know what the upper limit is going to be, and I think increasingly as we add new complexity and new requirements to these permits, that we also keep in mind to ensure that good projects that move forward can do so in a timely manner, and not one that has historically erred on the side of sort of open-ended processes, including with potential petitions, et cetera, that could slow the process. So I guess the summary of what I'm saying here is I don't see anything in the new policy language that references the importance of expeditious permitting processing.
Thank you, Jason. Natalia?
I would not add any timeline here because, first of all, this is framework. This is a broad framework, and project, let's say for offshore wind energy or hydrogen, whatever will come up, it could take up to 2 years. Okay, we can add that it could be from 6 months till up to 2 years, and what it give us. I mean, there is nothing because each process and that public comments and depends on the project complexity, and if it's inspection needed or additional technical expert hiring, it could take longer. So, and this is just framework, and nothing, I don't know, help if we add from 6 months to up to 2 years or maybe longer. It just add additional complexity. Because all those timelines would be in the guidelines for each specific sub-process, starting from pre-application meeting, then technical review. We will develop and say that there is some general timelines, a number of days, but it could be different, depends on the project. So I don't see that we should add here in the framework timelines. And I don't think that other parts of territorial sea plan have something like this with the timelines. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalia. Blake?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to, Jason's point about expeditious, application, review. I would be hesitant to add, that type of language because I don't want us to feel like we have to, quickly review an application. I feel like the state and other regulatory agencies should be allowed to take the time necessary to, to make those resource decisions, and not feel like we have to make decisions quickly, just because or rather, because the industry wants things, done quickly. My experience has been we go as quickly as we can. We don't needlessly hold things up. We do a great job of on our part of doing the things that we need to make our decisions, to create the documents, things of that nature. So I don't think it's necessary to add that type of language. We, as a regulatory agency, already do as much as we can to make that decision as quick as possible. So.
Thank you, Blake. Any other thoughts on this? What I'm gathering right now is that the petition process and this discussion of timelines should be relegated to rulemaking outside of the TSP Part 4. Is there any dissent from that? I am not seeing anything, so we can move on to the next portion. So I think that this defining Ocean Shores Recreation Area as it is defined in statute, it was kind of taken care of if the edit that we proposed for burial goes through. And it doesn't need to be defined there anymore. So I think that's kind of taken care of already in our previous discussion. Something that we had talked about earlier that Tara brought up is the recommendation of applying the decommission plan requirements for cables to all projects under the plan. And I can go back to the decommission section so that we can look at that a little bit better. Natalia, did you have something?
You are muted, Natalia.
Sorry. Yeah, I have for decommissioning section. I don't remember how we ended up to add back this language from House bill with specific number of days and etc. But initially, and now we come back again to this, should it apply to telecommunication cables or just in general? And we already decided that this is for all utilities and cables. So I think on working group 6, DSL proposed just 3 paragraphs, very short, for decommissioning and recovery section, without this 1, 2, 3, 4 bullets. And we justify this because it's already in House bill, this language. It's also this language already in the statute, RS 274, and it's related to telecommunication cables. So to avoid this confusion, we just can leave this first paragraph from 4.7 and delete 4.7.1 with those details for telecommunication cables, because it's already in House bill and it's already in ORS 274, the same language. And we know that that's related only particular to telecommunication cable. So we may say, like after first paragraph and 4.7, we leave this and then we can do second language, second paragraph, like the owner or operator of the I think infrastructure we mentioned, shall submit to DSL for approval decommissioning plan and follow the process for decommissioning. And we can indicate a specific statute or whatever, and delete those 1, 2, 3, 4, and then leave the last paragraph from this subsection where we added about if in some cases it could be more damaging to environmental, we can allow to leave that section of the cables. That was original what DSL proposed in 3 paragraphs, because we just repeated in territorial C plan the same time, number 3, again the same text, and now we discuss this confusion that, oh, it's only related to telecommunication cables, but we already decided that the innovation here is it's not just decommissioning, it's not just stopping from functioning or operating, it's also removal requirements, which is new, and we allow to stay some section in place if it's more damaging, and we may require DSL environmental impact assessment from the applicant. And we added that after discussion and learning experience from California and Washington, when they had this experience of explosion of cable and when power cables overlap with the telecommunication cables and some of the part of cables was broken, and then they issue how to remove and did everything. So that's why California was clear. We had this experience. That's why if something more damaging to remove all the section, we require environmental impact assessment. And that's why we put in the text that technical expert may need to hire additional to that. So, I mean, my suggestion to remove those repetitive texts that we have in House Bill and ORS 274 related to telecommunication cables, and just make it short. At the same time, we leave the space to add something new if it will appear for any cable infrastructure, offshore wind or hydrogen, etc. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalia. Tara?
Yeah, I think the question is whether we want to expand this level of detail from the statute to more than just cables, right? And then in which we would need to then keep it in here to have that detail apply to other projects. Because those projects were not part of the House bill.
I mean, even decommissioning, let's say, power cables, it could be different, and there more damages could be from the air and broken cables. It could be different, and we cannot just expand from telecommunication cables the same requirements even for removal with different infrastructure, whatever they will use for wind turbines and then connection to the onshore. And etc. And we don't know, I mean, yet. So to keep it broader and then develop separate maybe guidelines for decommissioning related to specific project would be give us more flexibility than just copy the text here and apply it to other utilities and pipelines.
But this, just to be clear, this language from the House bill does not refer specifically to telecommunications cables only. It is all undersea cables which conduct energy or light. So it does already include power cables, just to be clear about that.
But what about pipelines and other utilities?
I wasn't arguing that. I was just being very clear that this is not just telecommunications cables. So Delia, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, so if we did something like Natalia is suggesting and just removed 471, then what would be left would be the sort of default that all infrastructure shall be removed, and then the section about there are cases where it should be left in place. But I don't know how we handle anything other than cables. And I don't know that we have the right people on this work group to assess whether or not what our existing policies are for that. And, you know, for other non-cable infrastructure, I would want to know much more about how that's handled now. Whether the expectation is that outfalls and things like that have to be removed. I don't think they do. So I would want a lot more explanation around how other seafloor structures are handled now to make sure that anything that we add in here doesn't conflict with that before I'd be comfortable adding in decommissioning in place for more than just cables.
Thank you, Delia.
Yeah, go ahead.
Blake?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, current policy is for any of our contracts, leases, license, easements, if that, whatever is placed, you know, whether it's a pipeline, a cable, a boat ramp, a dock, if it is not being used, you know, for that purpose anymore, then it is, you know, by default assumed needing to be removed after, you know, the contract expires, right? So if we have a marina and the lease expires and they don't feel like operating that marina anymore, then they would be required to remove the marina. And in general, that applies to, you know, all of our contracts and for any improvements placed on DSL or rather on Oregon-owned waterways. So.
And Blake, follow up on that. Does that also include the option to decommission in place?
The only allowance for decommissioning in place that we have currently are for territorial sea cable easements.
Yeah, so then my perception is that would be a huge like new policy. And
It would.
I
I
don't know
mean,
if this is the
it
right
kind of
place for
would
that.
be a new
Yeah.
policy if we decided that we, you know, outside of undersea cables, that we would, you know, leave things in place. And I'm with you, Delia. If it's not an undersea cable, then I really don't feel like we can say like we can keep things in place, because we don't have a hydrogen pipeline that crosses the territorial sea or that spans it. We have some outfalls, and the way the contracts are written right now, if they are not being used, and they need to be removed. And now we have not faced that situation terribly often. I can't actually think of a situation where we have. And so, because most often these pipelines are, you know, critical to whatever, you know, public or private, you know, operation is going on. They're assets, they are maintained, and when the property is sold, they are continued to be used. So it's not very often that we run into, you know, this type of stuff. So.
Thank you, Blake. Scott, and then Andy.
Yeah, from practical experience, my conversation with the superintendent of one of the local sanitary districts on the coast indicated that when their pipeline was no longer in use, they abandoned it in place. There was no, I mean, I think it's reasonable to maybe say take off the diffuser if there's anything showing above the seabed, but you take I don't know what diameter, if it was a 10-inch or 12-inch diameter pipe, but a directional bore pipe like that, I think would be very, very difficult to ever remove. And if it was required to be removed, then I don't think you'd really want, and we talked about that before, you wouldn't really want them to excavate out a buried pipeline that goes out to just beyond the surf. There's really no reason not to abandon it in place that I can see. Other than maybe take off the diffuser and remove that would make sense, which can be accessed by divers. But what's in the ground, I mean, those ocean outfalls are maybe 30, 40, 50 feet under the seabed and under the beach. So we really want to dig that up?
Hey, Scott, Andy, I'm not trying to skip line. I don't dispute that, Scott. I was just only speaking about what current policy is. Like, we don't have in our outfall pipelines, we don't have it as far as, you know, I'd have to check each individual contract, but we, you know, currently don't have that decommissioning language. If we were in that situation, we would likely take it on a case-by-case basis and, you know, take reasonable efforts. I'm not going to dig up, you know, a giant portion of the ocean shore just to get rid of an 8-inch pipe. I don't think that would be reasonable, but what I'm just trying to speak to is what current policy is.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Blake. Andy.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to communicate that I have mixed feelings about this topic. One, in light of the conversation we just had about the details of the DSL application of their authorities and that being appropriate in rulemaking. I see direction here in the language of in 4.71 that does provide very specific timelines and details, which may or may not be appropriate in all circumstances. And when you broaden the idea to other infrastructure, I like the idea of having some bones on the structure of what the process for decommissioning is, what the expectations are, but not the level of detail, right? And I think as a big broad first principle, what Blake mentioned at the beginning, where if a project is done, the life of the project is over, the idea is that you decommission to a state in the environment that is as close to what it was beforehand as is practicable, right? If you take that approach from the beginning, then the idea of having decommissioning plans, of having some time for the agency to review that plan, for having limits on before an applicant or an owner can begin work, that they prove that they have the financial capabilities of actually completing that work and not leaving the state holding the cleanup costs. So I guess I just wanted to communicate. I think there's a lot of little issues tied up in this big question of, do we want to broaden our policy, in this case, from cables to other infrastructure? I think in general, my response is yes. I think I want to have a policy and some documentation in our plan that is the goal, that we have some basic sideboards around what that means, but that we not try and go to the detail that is in our existing section of this text. So I'm hoping that that resonates with some of you, and maybe the suggested path forward is, if we do have general agreement on this being applicable to all undersea infrastructure, and a process that DSL will manage around removal and or decommissioning in place, if that's the alternative that's the least environmentally or otherwise harmful. I think that we need to have that option as a state, and not be confined by our preconceived notions of what is risky or not when a certain circumstance comes up. So I guess that's my 2 cents on this.
Thank you, Andy. Delia?
Yeah, I hear you, Andy. I think at the broadest, highest level, we're always in favor of cleaning up the ocean and removing whatever we can. But then we have to acknowledge that some things are more damaging to remove, and then what do we need to do if we're going to leave them in place? And it just kind of spirals. So to me, if we're going to broaden the section to offer a new opportunity to decommission in place, which I think I heard Blake say does not exist in current policy, then it should just be the section, let's see. It should just be the is it 471?
The
That
paragraph
says,
above that, probably.
yeah, we
Just
should just
4.7.
it should just be the thing that says remove everything. And I don't think we should be introducing to this policy that we acknowledge that some things are going to have to be left in place unless we have a procedure for that in this policy. And I'm not comfortable creating a new policy for a new procedure for a new decommissioning activity or leaving it in place without a lot more thought and public process. So that's my thought.
Thank you, Delia. Tara?
Yeah, I don't think OPAC's intent was to create a new policy to leave things in place. I think the intent and what we heard was that they would like to see more detail, things like some sort of financial assurance, et cetera, these sort of more specific requirements that were put on cables. And there was not a clear understanding as why we would not do that for other infrastructure. But agree, I don't think there was any conversation, nor do I think OPAC would support a new policy for leaving pipelines in place. So perhaps just being broad with the language makes sense. And removing this part for undersea cables. Now, the question is does that remove the sort of leave in place option? DSL already has rules on that, where that is already an option for cables.
Yeah, it's in the easement agreement as well.
Yeah, I know that. I think Delia sent the ORS on it too. Someone dropped it in.
Yeah, that covers everything except the environmental assessment part. That would be new.
Right.
So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know where we stand on this. So there's a lot of back and forth. So I guess, I mean, the
I will
question,
just say that the guidance from OPAC was to have more detail. If we're going to have this sort of detail in here, that it should apply to all things, not just cables. That's what we heard. So that's what we were relaying back to the working group. I think it's fine if as a working group, we go back to OPAC and say, we thought about this and actually thought it was better to have a broad policy of you remove stuff, knowing that there's already this option for cables to decommission in place.
If I'm not jumping the line, I could suggest an alternative. It would be that we leave the default, remove everything in 4.7 and then keep 4.7.1 for undersea cables and just remove almost all of that section, but just acknowledge there may be cases where we have to leave them in. In those cases, we do an environmental assessment just for cables. And that's because we have existing policy for that. Other than that, I think we should just remove 4.7.1.
Delia, given our time, would you be willing to work with me and Andy and Marcus on some language to this effect?
And then maybe bring it back, yes, and then
in July. I mean, we could work on something to send off to DOJ, et cetera, and then yes, we can bring it back in July to the working group, and then OPAC obviously has the final say. But I think
yeah, could we ask
in terms of time, I want to make sure I'd be willing to work offline with anyone else who wants to work on this too. I'm happy to do that.
Blake, could you join us because it's your policies?
Of course, absolutely.
I think I hear what
today,
you were saying,
offline
Delia,
today.
so yeah, I think we could do this quickly.
Okay.
Is what I think could happen.
Okay.
I do have a meeting like almost right after this, so I don't know if, but yeah, I couldn't hear if you guys want to do that today or what.
I just think over email in the next few days, I think we could do, like I said,
That's
I have an idea of
perfect.
what Delia just proposed, and I think we could do this. We could suggest some red lines quickly.
okay, I agree with that.
But
Scott,
I see Scott's hand, yeah, so let's hear from Scott.
Well, I was just going to remind that House Bill 2603 does specifically say in section 1, number 3C, a detailed description of segments of bore pipe and undersea cable to be decommissioned. Let's see, proposed to be left in place to avoid or minimize impact to aquatic resources. So the legislation clearly made it very clear that that would be an option.
Agreed. We're just trying to broaden this. I think the idea is to take this up a level to include that idea, but have a broader policy for all infrastructure with the note that for undersea cables, there may be times where pieces are left in place because it's less damaging. And if that's going to be the case, then we require that environmental assessment mentioned below. And that's kind of all. That's kind of the proposal I heard. So, but yes, Scott, we hear that.
Yeah, and Scott, the entire 1 through 4, except for that E there, the rest of it is all from statute.
Yeah.
The language in the bill is copy paste from the statute. So that's what I'm saying. We already have a policy for that. And I think several people are saying that. Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
it's not a directive from the bill that we have to create something. It's a reference to a statute that already exists.
Great, thank you, Gary.
Yeah.
All right, excellent. So we will work on that. And let's move on and try and get to these last couple of points. So there was the discussion about written agreements and whether we want those to be enforceable policy or a policy of the state. And I think that was taken care of in the policy section with the DOJ review, removing 5 from the list. Section 3, sorry.
This is specific to the number part 5, the communication and written agreement section, I think.
Oh, was it?
Yeah. And there was a question about, again, requiring written agreements, can that be an enforceable policy? And sort of what is our feelings on, does that need to be an enforceable policy that we put on federal projects? Because NOAA might not agree to this. They might not approve this as an enforceable policy, but is the working group okay if this is just a policy of the state that we do this? And that was sort of that was the discussion that was had.
I see. Any thoughts on that? So it's this section, and it's whether we keep written agreements as just whether we want it to be an enforceable policy, and if we need to do some wordsmithing to make that so, or if we have this. I mean, I don't know that this would be rejected outright. I don't know if Jeff is still on the line, or what his thoughts are on that.
He is still on the line, so maybe, and I think the concern of this was, again, delegation of state authority to an entity other than the state. And I think that the way that this is written, we are not doing that, because all we are saying is that the written agreement is evidence of communication and coordination between 2 entities. Stop. Right. So I think that this is something that the state has felt very strongly about in the past 20 years as cables have been cited, and I would not want to see that changed. Even if it was not deemed an enforceable policy by NOAA, I would feel strongly that we would want to have it. And I feel like the work that we did just earlier today to clarify this section does help. So.
Jeff, do you want to respond quickly? I see your hand up. And then
Yeah, I agree with Andy, although is the language on the screen not the language that we agreed to? Because I thought we got rid of the specific, fishing gear, damaged utilities, et cetera, to keep it more general. But
yeah, this has not been changed. So this is the version that DOJ reviewed. And I think we agreed to deleting the last sentence and adding and dispute resolution at the last part of the sentence prior to that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I don't see this being a problem for enforceable policies because it starts with may consider and it leaves the power in DSL's hands. So.
Excellent. Scott?
I was just going to say the same thing. So Blake, Jeff already said it, but this I think was Steve Shipsey's effort to get it, to make sure that it would be compliant. I would point out, though, that while the beginning says they may consider it, the last sentence, as it was written, says written documentation shall specify. So here, something that's sort of not a requirement is very specifically says what it shall include, which I think it's a good call to just get rid of that.
Yep. Good thing we don't have that issue anymore. We change it.
All right. I think we could probably move on since this was figured out previously. Just, I guess we already noted that OPAC decided not to limit potential scope of the plan by including directly in front of directly affecting the territorial sea. So, and then this last point is a discussion over the scope of projects that would be covered by the plan, specifically relating to artificial reefs and the need to change the definition of fixture. Tara recommends that we remove infra from the definition in front of structure. So it just, I'll go down to the glossary. Oh, we're already there. Let's find.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to this too. So our definition of infrastructure is really limited to that relating to utilities. And so something like an artificial reef or even scientific equipment would not be included in that, right? Because it's not related to a utility. So we have specifically kind of boxed infrastructure into, you know, these industries, I think. But fixtures are still covered throughout the plan. But our definition of fixture currently actually it says includes any infrastructure, which would then again limit fixtures to utility infrastructure. So I think if we just say fixtures includes any structure affixed to or permanently placed on the seafloor, not otherwise defined in this glossary, including but not limited to scientific and research devices, etc., that would get at, you know, the question of artificial reefs, of I think scientific buoys was brought up, several other things. So I see Delia's hand up, but that was just the thinking there.
Delia? Thank you, Tara.
I see where this is headed. It's kind of the difference between anthropogenic structures and natural structures, I think. Well, maybe not though for artificial reefs. I guess I just wanted to make the point that in general, as a rule, we don't support artificial reefs in Oregon. That's a California thing. But in Oregon, we really we really shy away from it. We want to protect our natural reefs and shy away from artificial reefs. So I kind of like the definitions as is, because I think that distinction is more clear. What we're talking about.
Right now, just to be clear, right now, the definitions as is would not actually include scientific or research devices, even though we say that fixtures are those things. We say that fixtures includes any infrastructure, and then we separately define infrastructure as relating to utilities. And so I think that's the problem.
So, okay, that's a good clarification.
Yeah.
So the distinction is between all infrastructure versus just that related to utilities.
Well, we've actually limited, we've limited infrastructure. Yes, I get it. Infrastructure we have defined as only foundation, physical assets that provide the foundation or basic for a utility. So that would not include scientific research or other things. So it's very specific to, and then we also say and fixtures at the end of that one. So we're just trying to clean up these definitions. And I agree that I hear you on the not supporting, our state has not supported artificial reefs, but I think the idea being that any artificial reef application that came to DSL, we would want to apply our policies and form a JART so that ODFW and others could weigh, I think that was the idea, is like, where would artificial reefs land? Now DSL would still be able to receive an application for that, but it somehow wouldn't be covered by TSP 4. So there was like a sort of scope problem, I think.
Yeah, the way I heard the OPAC discussion, they were interested in Part 4 applying to artificial reefs as a fixture because it would be a permanent structure that's placed on the seafloor. And then we would want to have this plan apply to the permitting and the discussion around whether or not the state would allow that use.
So I have an alternate. I'm never mind. I'm jumping the line. Mike's next.
Mike.
Well, I was just going to offer that if you just leave the word infrastructure out of the definition of fixture and just say includes anything affixed to the permanently placed to the seafloor, not otherwise defined in this glossary, you'd be there.
I think that works too, either way.
But I think Tara's raised a really great point. I mean, if you have the word infrastructure embedded in another definition, then then the definition of infrastructure controls. And so basically, she's saying that fixtures and infrastructure are synonyms. And it sounds as though we want to make them as distinct from one another, that an infrastructure would be a subset of a fixture. So a fixture would be anything that's affixed to the bottom, except that's not otherwise defined in the glossary. So if you just leave out infrastructure, because that's otherwise defined in the glossary.
Thank you, Mike.
That's how I understood Tara's original suggestion, is to just call things structure affixed to the seafloor.
Likewise.
Yeah. So I do agree we need to take infrastructure out of the fixture definition. I think that we would need to do that in any case. And then we need to be clear how we're referencing that in the rest of the plan.
Thank you. Delia, and then, oh wait, all the hands disappeared. So maybe we don't have any more discussion about this.
I had my hand up for a second, but I just didn't want to prolong it unnecessarily. I was just going to say that I mean, I get what the conversation is about, but I do feel like that the phrase "not otherwise defined" in this glossary really is one of the defining phrases for a fixture. So a fixture couldn't be infrastructure to a utility because that is defined in the glossary, and fixture
Right.
refers to things that aren't defined in the glossary. So that's where I was coming from, but I'm happy to, I agree, let's remove infrastructure. That would really clear things up and just say structure.
Thank you, Blake. Delia, did you have something to say on this? Just wanted to loop back to you because you earlier had said you jumped the
No,
line.
I get it. I get it.
Okay,
Yep.
perfect.
Thanks.
Excellent. So I think we have consensus on removing infrastructure and just having it say includes any structure affixed to, and then have it be the same as it is. Mike?
Why do you even have to use the word structure? It could just be includes anything affixed or permanently placed on the seafloor.
Not to be too, absurd, but like if you say anything, would that include organic material that may degrade? Like if somebody affixed, good grief.
Well, I was flipping it around
carcass.
just to say if you just say any structure, then you can say, well, what's a structure? So, so if it's just anything, then it's, if it's not defined elsewhere, then it's anything. Because
Laurel?
what if a rock rubble pile may not, is that a structure? It's something.
I think it should read, just remove includes any infrastructure and say anthropogenic structures affixed to or permanently placed.
Do we have a definition for a structure?
I don't think
Is a pipeline a structure?
That's otherwise defined in this
yes,
glossary.
but it's otherwise defined in the glossary.
Laurel?
I was just going to point out, it's not anything, it's those things requiring an easement, right? So it's whatever is triggering DSL's request for an easement, right? It's the.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. It's about, what requires an authorization. And really that shouldn't just be limited to territorial sea easement. A structure may require, I can't think of something off the top of my head, but a structure may require another type of authorization from the department, a proprietary authorization, whether it's a lease, a license, or, we issue special use leases in the territorial sea. And so that's not a territorial sea easement. But those things would likely still be considered a fixture. So I think that if we say it includes any structure, we don't need to define structure because we've already have these caveats that are, it's not otherwise defined in the glossary, and that it requires a territorial sea easement or authorization from DSL. So I think those are helping to define what that actually is.
Laurel asks in the chat, do we need to tweak the easement part then to include authorizations? And I would say I would say yes, based on what Blake just said. So
Sorry, I didn't catch that previously.
I'm sorry. So maybe includes any structure, etc., all the way down to or other structures requiring a territorial sea easement or authorization. And then keep it the way it is otherwise. That's what I'm hearing. Does that, everybody okay with that change?
I am. I just have a question about capitalizing easement because I don't actually think it should be capitalized in that context. But others can correct me.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's not a proper noun in this
Yeah. In this
situation.
We're not referencing a specific easement. Yeah.
All right, I will lowercase that e then. All right, but I'm not seeing any dissent on that. So I think we made it through everything. Other than there are other changes throughout this DOJ document. Most of them have to do with just changing things to a more active voice, or making things a little more explicit in certain areas. So if going through this, I would like for you all to go through it. And if you have any comments on it, please get those back to me as soon as possible, because I am trying to get a version of this back out to DOJ and NOAA next week. So if you have some time over the next couple of days to take a look at this DOJ document, give me comments. And then I guess that kind of brings us to the end-ish time of our meeting, which is good. And I'm glad that I'm totally lost here. I guess I didn't put in a slide. But what I had meant to talk about was just kind of just reiterating what we're going to be doing moving forward. And that is tribal consultation, review from NOAA, review from DOJ again, looping it back in, getting all of those comments and all of that information back to you guys before the next working group meeting. And also, I guess I could check in now with Reed, if Reed's still on the line. I don't know if he is, but as to the status of the landing site report, that should be done by the 15th. If everything's still on schedule. I don't know if Reed's still here though.
I don't see him.
I don't see him either. So I'll check in with him. That should be here on the 15th, and I will get it out to all of you and on the website as soon as possible. And then kind of moving along with the timeline as we saw before, I think Andy will get a firm date for that OPAC meeting as soon as he can, and we'll send that out as well. So thank you so much for today. And we really did move through a lot of material today, and I'm really happy that we got through it all. That's all I have to say. Blake, did you? Oh, you're waving goodbye.
Oh, I thought that was the hand clapping.
Those are claps. Those are claps.
Yeah, I thought
It
those
is,
were the
it is,
clapping hands.
it is.
It
I
does
couldn't.
kind of look like a wave too, though, admittedly.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, everyone. And so if you have any other comments or anything, though, get them to me as soon as possible. Just reiterating that because I really need them if we're going to be sending this out. Otherwise, I guess I'll give you 9 more minutes back in your day.
Thank you, everyone. Marcus.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Marcus. Blake and Delia, I'll be in touch. Our follow-up task.
Perfect.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
Perfect. Okay.
Thank
Bye, guys.
you.
Thanks,
Thank you all.
everyone.
Take
Bye.
care.